Hey everyone! Welcome back to Eldritch Potter. Get ready for an amazing tale. Gringotts Curse Breaker found baby Harry dying at age 2 and blood scan revealed 47 dark curses Dumbledore placed since birth. Smash that like button and subscribe for more. Here we go. Chapter 1, The Cupboard. The assignment sheet said, Routine Vault Survey, Muggle Adjacent Property, Suspected Residual Enchantment on Structural Foundations. Samir Voss had done 412 of these. He knew this because Amara kept count, and Amara kept count because she found his increasing disdain for routine assignments both amusing and professionally concerning. 413, she said, stepping out of the apparition point behind him, a narrow gap between hedgerows on Wisteria Walk, 2 streets over from the target address. She tucked the transit scroll into her jacket and surveyed the street with the particular brand of mild distaste she reserved for Muggle suburbia. Try to look less like you're planning a funeral. I'm not planning a funeral. I'm attending one. There's a difference. Samir adjusted the strap of his field satchel and started walking. 4 hours minimum on a residual enchantment survey. On a Tuesday. When I could be finishing the Gnosis decryption. The Gnosis decryption has been waiting 3 months. It can wait another afternoon. The Gnosis decryption is a 7th century Minoan curse lattice with moving components, and I am this close. You've been this close for 11 weeks, Samir. He didn't have a response to that, mostly because it was accurate, so he walked in silence instead, hands in his jacket pockets, scanning the street the way he always did, not looking for anything specific, just letting the ambient magic of an area settle against his senses the way a sound settles into a room. Most people couldn't feel it. Curse breakers who'd been in the field long enough developed a kind of passive sensitivity, less like a skill and more like a chronic condition. The world was always faintly humming, and you learned to read the hum. Privet Drive was quiet. Detached houses in matching shades of cream and beige, gardens trimmed with the aggression of people who had nothing better to do with their anxieties. A dog barking 2 streets over. The smell of cut grass and someone's roast dinner. Ordinary. The kind of ordinary that was so aggressively maintained it started to feel like a performance. Samir paused at the corner of Privet Drive and pulled out the survey parchment. Number 4. Third house on the left, set slightly back from the road, roses in the front garden that had been pruned into perfect submission. He felt it before he reached the gate. Not the residual enchantment noted on the survey sheet, that was there too, faint and structural, embedded in the foundations the way old magic sometimes settled into stone and brick after years. That wasn't what stopped him. What stopped him was something else. Something underneath the ordinary hum of the street, underneath even the enchantment on the house. Something low and wrong and pressurized, like a sound that was too low for ears but not too low for the part of him that had spent 12 years breaking curses in tombs and temples and places where dark magic had been left to fester for centuries. He put a hand out and stopped Amara without looking at her. She stopped immediately. That was one of the things he valued most about her, she didn't ask questions when his hand went out. She'd learned, 2 years into their partnership, that when Samir stopped moving it was because something had already made the decision for him. You feel that? He asked, quietly. A pause. Then, yes. Her voice had changed. The dry amusement was gone. What is that? I don't know yet. He lowered his hand and looked at the house. Nothing visible. Roses. Gravel path. A car in the driveway so recently washed it was still faintly damp. It's coming from inside. The survey only flagged foundation enchantment. The survey was wrong. He pushed open the gate. Or it was only seeing the top layer. They walked up the path, and the feeling intensified with every step, that low, pressurized wrongness, gaining texture the closer they got. Samir was cataloging it automatically, the way he cataloged everything, breaking it into component sensations. There was compression in it, the particular magical signature of something bound or contained. There was age in it, not centuries, not even decades, but a specific kind of layering that came from multiple workings applied repeatedly over time. And there was damage. The signature of damage was something he'd never quite been able to explain to people who hadn't felt it. It was like the difference between a stone wall and a cracked one. The magic felt stressed. Load-bearing and failing. He knocked on the door. The man who answered was large in a way that suggested he'd once been merely big and had spent the intervening years burying whatever shape he'd originally had under a substantial layer of something else. Pink-faced, small-eyed, wearing a tie that had absolutely no business existing. He looked at Samir and then at Amara with the particular expression of someone who was about to ask if they were selling something. Samir held up his Gringotts field identification, the gold-embossed card with the goblin seal that the ministry couldn't countermand and had occasionally tried to. Gringotts Wizarding Bank. We're here regarding a structural survey of the property at this address. We'll need access to the interior. The man, Dursley, the survey sheet said. Vernon, blinked. I don't know anything about my wife handles Mr. Dursley. Samir's voice didn't change. It stayed level, pleasant, and completely immovable. This is a legal requirement under the Goblin Territories and Property Charter of 1782, which supersedes residential privacy statutes in cases of active magical survey. You can let us in, or I can have a representative from the bank's legal division here within the hour with a formal enforcement notice. The second option takes longer and is significantly less pleasant for everyone. Your choice. Vernon Dursley opened the door. The inside of the house was exactly what the outside promised, pristine, coordinated, and decorated with the kind of determination that left no room for anything unexpected. Family photographs on the walls. A large, blond boy's face grinning from multiple frames at various ages, holding up trophies and birthday cakes and the general evidence of a life being enthusiastically celebrated. Samir scanned the photographs automatically as he stepped inside. In not one of them was there a second child. The wrong feeling was stronger inside. Much stronger. Samir felt Amara shift slightly closer to him, not from fear but from the same instinct he was feeling, the trained field response to an environment where the magic was behaving badly. His hand had already moved to the diagnostic instruments in his satchel. Where is the structural issue located? Dursley was asking, hovering near the door in the way of a man who wanted to be in the room without being near whatever was in it. Because I've always said the foundation's on this street, Mr. Dursley. Amara had moved to the hallway without Samir noticing she'd gone. She did that, moved quietly in ways that were slightly unsettling even after 4 years of partnership. She was standing very still, looking at something under the stairs. What is in this cupboard? The cupboard was small. Of course it was the space under a staircase, a triangular void that most people filled with coats and hoovers and the accumulated debris of domestic life. This one had a door. A door with a bolt on the outside. The bolt was currently thrown. That's just storage, Dursley started. The bolt is on the outside, Amara said, and her voice had gone very quiet in a way that Samir knew meant she was keeping it deliberate. Why is there a bolt on the outside of a storage cupboard? Dursley stopped. For organizational, Samir had already crossed the hallway. He could feel it clearly now, right through the door, the compressed, layered, damaged magic signature, concentrated and close, and beneath it something organic, something that shouldn't be here, shouldn't be in this enclosed space radiating heat and wrongness. He put his hand on the door and felt the magic push back against his palm like pressure against a bruise. He threw the bolt and opened the door. The smell hit him first, close air and something faintly medicinal and the particular smell of a space that had been occupied by something small and warm for a long time. Then the dark resolved itself as his eyes adjusted, and he saw the child. The boy was maybe 2 years old. Maybe. It was hard to say because he was small in the way of children who hadn't been fed enough, not the compact smallness of a healthy toddler but the reduced smallness of something that had been given less than it needed for long enough that the deficit had become structural. He was asleep, or unconscious, Samir couldn't tell which immediately, curled on what appeared to be a child's sleeping bag laid on the floor of the cupboard, his dark hair matted against his forehead, his breathing audible from the doorway in a way that breathing shouldn't be. On his forehead, partially hidden by the matted hair, was a scar shaped like a lightning bolt. Samir's brain processed that last detail and filed it in the category of deal with this later because right now the category of deal with this immediately was full. He was inside the cupboard and kneeling before the thought to move had fully formed, 2 fingers against the child's throat, pulse present, rapid and shallow, other hand already pulling the preliminary diagnostic instrument from his satchel. The malediction gauge was a goblin-designed instrument that looked something like a compass and something like a pocket watch and functioned as neither. It measured the presence and density of active magical workings on or within a living subject. Samir had used it on everything from cursed artifacts to hexed individuals to, memorably, a mildly enchanted cat in Prague. He'd never seen it react the way it reacted now. The needle didn't settle. It went to the far end of the scale, hit the stop, and vibrated there. A faint, high tone came from the instrument, not a sound it was designed to make, not a sound it had ever made in his experience, more like the instrument equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. "Amara," he said. She was already behind him, crouching in the doorway. She saw the gauge. He heard her exhale. "Get the full blood scan kit," he said. "Not the field kit, the full one." "Samir, we can't run a full blood scan without, Goblin Law, Section 14, Paragraph 7. Any magical being found in conditions constituting mortal peril may be subjected to full diagnostic scan under Gringotts Emergency Authority, no ministry sign-off required." He was already pulling out his personal diagnostic instruments, the ones he carried beyond the standard field kit because 12 years of curse breaking had taught him that the standard kit was always missing something important. "This child is in mortal peril. Get the kit." He heard her stand and move away. Heard Desley making some noise in the background, protest, or the beginnings of one, and heard it stop in a way that suggested Amara had done something to prevent it continuing. He didn't look up. The boy was still breathing. Short, labored breaths that Samir didn't like the sound of. His color was wrong, too pale, with a grayish undertone that spoke of exhaustion deeper than sleep. There was a faint tremor in his hands, barely visible, the kind of thing you'd only notice if you were looking closely. Samir was looking closely. "Hey," he said, softly, to the child. "I've got you. You're okay." The words were automatic, the same words he used at every scene where someone was hurt and he needed them to stay with him, words that were less about content and more about establishing a human presence in a space that had been apparently quite short of one. "I'm going to figure out what's wrong. Just stay with me." The boy didn't respond. The breathing continued, shallow and rapid. Amara returned with the full kit and knelt beside him, and they worked in the efficient silence of long partnership. She set up the containment field, he calibrated the scan array, she positioned the primary instruments while he checked the secondary readings, no instructions needed, each movement complementing the other the way movements did when 2 people had been doing this long enough that the practice had become its own language. The blood scan took 4 minutes to initialize and another 3 to run. It was the most comprehensive magical diagnostic tool Gringotts possessed, developed over centuries, refined through thousands of applications, capable of identifying not just active curses but residual workings, historical enchantments, binding spells, magical suppressants, loyalty enchantments, compulsion charms, and every other form of magical interference with a living subject's innate magical core. In the field, Samir had run it maybe 30 times. The highest number of distinct magical workings he'd ever found on a single subject, a Macedonian curse victim who'd walked through a trapped tomb and triggered 11 separate ancient workings, was 11. The scan completed. The results printed onto the parchment in the precise, unflinching script of goblin diagnostic notation. Samir read the list once. Then he read it again. Then he set the parchment down on his knee and sat very quietly for a moment in the cramped, dark space of the cupboard under the stairs at Number 4, Privet Drive, and let the number settle into him. 47. 47 distinct magical workings on a child who was not yet 3 years old. He picked the parchment back up and read it properly this time, not skimming, not trying to get to the number, but reading each entry. This was the kind of reading that required you to hold everything else still and just look at what was actually there, which was a skill that took years to develop and was arguably the most important one he possessed. The workings fell into categories that became clear as he read. There were pain anchors, 4 of them, dormant but active, tied to emotional states and triggered by comfort or affection, designed to make the child associate warmth with pain. There were binding spells, 7, layered one over another in the specific way that maximum compression required, all of them targeting the child's magical core, wrapping it tight and cutting off access the way a tourniquet cut off blood flow. There were compulsion weaves, 5, designed to produce specific behaviors. Compliance. Smallness. The particular psychological posture of a child who had learned not to ask for too much. There were 3 loyalty anchors that went deeper than compulsion. These were invasive, root-level workings that were designed to survive the subject's own awareness, to operate below conscious thought and shape preference and trust and the felt sense of safety. They were pointed, as far as the scan could determine, at a single target beneficiary. The scan couldn't name the beneficiary. The blood scan didn't work that way. But the signatures could be traced. Every piece of magic had a signature, a unique combination of intent, casting method, and personal magical resonance that was as individual as a fingerprint. Samir had spent 12 years learning to read signatures. He'd built a working index of 5,000 distinct magical signatures from curse sites across 4 continents. And the signatures on every single one of the 47 workings on this child's blood were not just similar to each other, they were identical. Same intent pattern. Same casting structure. Same resonant frequency, adjusted slightly across workings but unmistakably the same underlying source. One caster. Every single curse, every binding, every compulsion, every pain anchor, every loyalty trap. One person had done all of this. Systematically. Over time. Starting, based on the layering patterns and the scan's dating analysis, from the earliest weeks of the child's life. There were dates in the scan record, approximate, within a range of days or weeks rather than exact, and they told a story Samir did not want to believe but was professionally incapable of disbelieving. The first working had been placed when the child was approximately 3 weeks old. The most recent, based on the decay rate of the active components, was less than 4 months ago. He became aware that Amara had been quiet for some time and looked up to find her reading over his shoulder, her face doing the careful, neutral thing it did when she was processing something that would otherwise make her expression unsuitable for the situation. "The signatures," he said. "I see them." Her voice was flat. "You recognize them?" A pause. She straightened up slightly, which was not agreement but was not disagreement either. "Run the signature comparison," she said. "Against the bank's registered magical index." "I know what the comparison is going to say." "Run it anyway." "We're not doing this without documentation." He ran it. The comparison took 40 seconds. The result came back in the same precise goblin script as the rest of the scan. Signature match, 98.7% correspondence with indexed magical signature of Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. Supreme Mugwump, International Confederation of Wizards. Chief Warlock, Wisingamot. Headmaster, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The child on the floor took a slightly shallower breath, and Samir put the parchment down with great care and picked up his healing kit. "Start the emergency stabilization," he said. "We need to get him stable enough to move before we do anything else." Samir. "I know. 47. This child is, I know." He met her eyes for a moment. Hers were doing the thing they did when she was very controlled about something that was making her very angry. His, he suspected, were doing something similar. "We're going to deal with it. All of it. But first we get him stable and we get him out of this cupboard." He looked back at the boy. The dark hair. The lightning bolt scar. The shallow breathing of a child who had been systematically dismantled since before he could speak. "Can you get Desley into a containment interview in the other room?" Full memory record, everything he knows about the child's placement here, who placed him, when, under what instructions. Everything. With pleasure, Amara said, and the two words carried so much compressed intention that Samir was briefly grateful he wasn't Vernon Dursley. He turned back to Harry Potter and began to work. The emergency stabilization process was, in technical terms, a triage of magical interference. You couldn't remove the curses in the field, not safely, not without the full resources of a dedicated curse-breaking facility and a team of goblin healers. What you could do was identify the workings that were currently causing the most acute damage and put temporary blocks around them, not removing them, but isolating them, cutting the active current between the working and the subject's body so the damage stopped compounding while transport was arranged. Samir had done this in Egyptian tombs. He'd done it in the ruins of a dark wizard's manor in Romania. He'd done it once in an airport in Zurich under circumstances he didn't especially enjoy recounting. He had never done it on a child. He had never done it on someone this small, this young, this comprehensively worked on, and the experience of doing so required him to be very deliberate about keeping his hands steady and his focus technical, because the alternative was anger, and anger was not useful right now. He worked through the most acute workings first. Two of the pain anchors were actively firing, triggered by something, possibly by his own magical proximity, and he isolated those. One of the binding weaves was under stress, which was what was causing the labored breathing, and he put a temporary structural brace around it. The magical equivalent of splinting a fracture, you didn't fix it, you stabilized it so the movement didn't make it worse. The boy stirred once. Opened his eyes, green, startlingly bright and clear in the half-dark, and looked at Samir with the expression of someone who was not quite sure whether they were awake or dreaming. "Hello," Samir said. Same level tone. "I'm Samir. I'm going to help you. You don't have to do anything." The boy blinked. His mouth moved slightly. Then his eyes closed again and he was asleep, or unconscious. The breathing was better now, deeper, the stabilization doing what it was meant to do. From the other room came the sound of Amara's voice, quiet and methodical, and the occasional sputtering protest from Vernon Dursley, which was diminishing in frequency in the way that protests did when confronted with the particular kind of calm patience that refused to be moved. Samir kept working. His hands moved through the diagnostic motions with the efficiency of muscle memory while his mind was somewhere else entirely, running through every implication of what the parchment said. 47 workings. The signature of the most powerful and respected wizard alive. A child who had been placed in this house, put here, by someone, for a reason, in a situation that had been kept from anyone who might have intervened, a child who bore the scar that the entire wizarding world knew meant he'd survived the killing curse at 15 months old. Harry Potter. The boy who lived. Who had, apparently, been surviving something considerably more sustained and deliberate ever since. Samir finished the stabilization, checked his readings, checked them again, and then carefully gathered the boy from the floor of the cupboard and carried him into the sitting room. He was lighter than he should have been for his age, which Samir added to a list that was already long enough. Amara had Vernon Dursley seated at the kitchen table with a memory record charm running and a look on her face that had, apparently, already efficiently dismantled most of his resistance. There was a woman, Petunia Dursley, presumably, sitting very still at the other end of the table with the expression of someone who had decided that if they remained completely motionless, the situation might somehow not be happening. "How did the child come to be in your care?" Amara was asking, with the tone of someone conducting a quarterly review. He was left. Dursley's voice had lost most of its blustering quality and had settled into a defensive mumble. "On the doorstep. In November. There was a letter." "From whom?" "Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore. The letter said, it said the boy needed to be kept here. For his protection. Said he had to stay here, couldn't go anywhere else, couldn't be, the boy was supposed to stay with Petunia because of the blood protection, it said." "Did the letter specify the conditions of the child's care?" A pause. "It said to keep him safe." "And the cupboard under the stairs?" Amara said, in exactly the same tone. Where a child of not yet 3 years old has been sleeping on a floor. Is that where you keep things that are safe, Mr. Dursley? Vernon Dursley said nothing. Samir had settled Harry on the sofa with a conjured blanket and was watching the boy's breathing with the monitoring instrument still running when Amara came and stood beside him. She had the memory record scroll in her hand and her expression was the one she wore after particularly unpleasant field work. He was left here by Dumbledore, she said, quietly. On the doorstep. November 1st, 1981. The night after the Dark Lord's defeat. No ministry sign-off. No formal guardianship arrangement. A letter, nothing more. What did the letter say? Dursley doesn't have it anymore. Petunia does. She paused. She says she burned it. I don't think she's lying. Another pause. Samir, they knew. They knew about the cupboard. They've been aware of the conditions. They made a choice. What does the Muggle law say about this? A great deal. None of it pleasant. She looked at the sleeping boy. What are we doing? It was the question that needed answering, and Samir had been formulating the answer since the moment the blood scan results came through. The answer had several layers, each one building on the one beneath, and the foundations of it were in a part of the Gringotts operational charter that most curse breakers never needed to access because the situations it covered were supposed to be theoretical. Goblin law, emergency guardianship provision, he said. When a magical individual is found in mortal peril, under active curse, with no competent guardian present or available, Gringotts may invoke temporary guardianship pending formal proceedings. It's Section 8, it's been law since 1347, and it has exactly the same legal weight as a ministry order. He looked at Amara. More, in some jurisdictions. The ministry will contest it. Let them. Dumbledore will, let him. Samir looked at the blood scan results in his hand. 47 workings. A signature matched to 98.7% certainty. He's going to find out we were here eventually. I'd rather he finds out after we have the boy, the documentation, the memory records, and a goblin legal team that makes the ministry look like it's handling parking disputes. He folded the parchment carefully and put it in his inner pocket. No one knows we're here. No one knows what the survey was for. We file the emergency guardianship, we get the boy to the Gringotts medical facility, and we begin the formal curse-breaking process. His tone hadn't changed. It was still level, still measured, still the professional voice of a field operative making operational decisions. But there was something underneath it that had been there since the moment he'd opened that cupboard door and that was not going anywhere. And then we document everything. Every single one of 47 workings. We trace every signature. We date every application. We build a record that is so complete and so watertight that no amount of political influence, institutional prestige, or popular goodwill is sufficient to make it go away. Amara was quiet for a moment. Then, you know who this is going to destroy? Yes. And you're certain? He looked at the boy on the sofa. 2 years old. Green eyes and a lightning bolt scar and 47 curses woven through his magical core like wire through bone, placed there by the most trusted wizard in the world because, why? Because a chess player needed a piece that couldn't move unless commanded to. Because a general needed a soldier who didn't know he was being shaped. Because the man who'd guided the entire wizarding world through and out of its darkest period apparently couldn't conceive of a victory that didn't require him to hold all the pieces. Yes, Samir said. I'm certain. He stood, crossed to the kitchen doorway, and looked at the Dursleys. Vernon's face had gone past pink into a color that suggested his cardiovascular system was having opinions. Petunia sat rigid and pale and silent, her eyes not quite meeting his. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley, Samir said, under the emergency guardianship provision of Goblin Law, Section 8, the child known as Harry Potter is being removed from this property effective immediately. You will receive formal notification of proceedings from Gringotts Legal Division within 48 hours. In the meantime, the memory records taken this afternoon constitute admissible documentation and will be retained by the bank. He paused. Do you have any questions? They didn't, apparently. Or they had many but couldn't form them. Good, he said. The transport arrangements for Harry Potter took 20 minutes, a secure transit bubble, a stabilization harness, the full monitoring kit running continuous readings, Amara managing the transit while Samir handled the security protocols. Standard emergency medical extraction, the same procedure they'd have used for any curse victim in the field. Except that curse victims in the field were, as a rule, not 2-year-old children, and the professional distance that the procedure required was working harder than usual. Before they left, Samir took one more measurement with his personal instruments, not a diagnostic, this time, but a structural record. The full magical profile of the environment at Number 4 Privet Drive, captured in every dimension the instruments could measure. He'd learned early that what you documented at a scene was always more than you thought you needed, and what you didn't document was always exactly what someone later claimed hadn't been there. He documented everything. The enchantment on the foundations, which turned out, on closer inspection, not to be a general structural enchantment at all but something more targeted, more personal, with a signature that matched the others. Another working, placed on the property rather than on the child. He noted it. He recorded it. He added it to the documentation with a notation marking it for analysis at the facility. 48, then. 47 on the child, 1 on the house. All the same signature. They left Privet Drive at 4:37 in the afternoon of an unremarkable Tuesday in August. A transit bubble carrying one 2-year-old wizard in critical but stable condition. 2 field operatives carrying enough documentation to initiate the most significant legal action the Goblin Nation had taken against the wizarding establishment in 300 years. In Hogsmeade, in his office that overlooked the school valley, Albus Dumbledore was presumably doing whatever he did on quiet Tuesday afternoons. Reading, perhaps. Corresponding. Planning, the way he always was planning, with the patient confidence of a man who believed he could see further than anyone else and had rarely been given cause to doubt it. He had no way of knowing that on a residential street in Surrey, the timeline he'd been managing for a year and a half had just been interrupted by a man with a malediction gauge and 12 years of practice looking at what was actually there. Samir sat across from Harry's sleeping form in the transit bubble and felt the wrongness of the boy's magical signature against his awareness, all that compressed, damaged, pressurized magic, bound up in a small body that didn't know it was carrying it. His mind was already at the facility. Already at the documentation phase. Already 3 steps ahead, because 3 steps ahead was how you survived in this field. But the part of him that was not professionally 3 steps ahead, the part of him that had opened that cupboard door and seen what was inside, was doing something else. It was making a different kind of record. Not on parchment. Not in the official Gringotts format with its precise script and its percentage confidence ratings. The kind of record that went somewhere deeper. That didn't get filed. That stayed. He looked at the boy. At the small, too thin body. At the scar that the entire wizarding world had been told was the mark of a miracle. No one's getting their hands on you again, he said, very quietly, to the sleeping child. Not without going through considerably more than they bargained for. Harry Potter breathed in, and breathed out, and the monitoring instruments showed his vital signs slowly, incrementally, improving. The transit bubble moved silently through the space between places, carrying its passengers toward London, toward Gringotts, toward the beginning of a great deal of trouble for a great many people. Samir Voss opened his field notebook and began to write. Chapter 2, The 47 The Gringotts medical facility existed in the sublevels of the bank, below the vaults, below the cart tunnels, below even the deepest security corridors that ministry officials were occasionally permitted to tour with expressions of carefully managed unease. Most wizards didn't know it was there. The ones who did know tended to assume it was a small operation, a triage room for curse-related accidents, the magical equivalent of a first aid station. They were wrong by a considerable margin. The facility occupied 7 interconnected chambers carved directly from the bedrock of London, maintained at a constant temperature that goblins found optimal and humans found slightly too cool, lit by a particular quality of light that had no obvious source and cast no shadows. The walls were lined with instruments that had been in continuous development since the 14th century. The goblin healers who staffed it had undergone training that made the standard St. Mungo's curriculum look like a brief pamphlet. They were not warm, exactly. Warmth was not a quality that goblins particularly prioritized, but they were precise, and in Samir's professional experience, precision saved more lives than warmth did. Healer Griphook the Elder, no relation to the younger Griphook who worked the upper vault levels, met them at the intake chamber with the expression of someone who had been informed of the situation in transit and had opinions about it that he was holding in reserve until he'd seen the data himself. He was old even by goblin standards, his face a landscape of controlled severity, his eyes the particular amber that signified a healer at the top of the seniority register. He looked at Harry Potter, took the monitoring readouts from Samir, scanned them in approximately 4 seconds, and said, "Intake Chamber 3. Now." They moved. The next hour was clinical and fast and entirely in goblin hands, which was where Samir wanted it. He and Amara stood against the far wall of Intake Chamber 3 and stayed out of the way, which was the correct professional behavior and also required more conscious effort than either of them would have admitted. Griphook the Elder directed 2 junior healers through the immediate stabilization with the economy of motion and instruction that came from decades of doing the same thing with complete competence, no wasted words, no performed urgency, just the clean efficient work of people who knew exactly what they were doing. Harry was placed on the diagnostic platform, a raised surface inlaid with instruments that made Samir's field kit look like a child's toy, and the full facility scan began running. The results, when they came, were projected onto the wall in goblin script that Samir read as fluently as English. The blood scan he'd run in the field had been thorough, but the facility scan was something else entirely. It didn't just identify the workings. It mapped them, their positions within the child's magical core, their interactions with each other, their impact on the surrounding magical tissue, the damage accumulated over the time they'd been in place. The map was not easy to look at. The compression bindings alone, Griphook said, without looking up from his instruments, have been in place long enough to cause structural deformation of the core pathways. At this rate, he paused. Another 3 months without intervention and the compression damage would have become self-sustaining. What does that mean in practical terms? Amara asked. It means the core pathways would have begun to collapse. Magic does not survive the collapse of its own pathways. He said it the way he said everything, precisely and without inflection. The child would have lost his magic entirely. And as the core pathways and the body's vital systems are, in magical individuals, interdependent from birth, he would have died, Samir said. Yes. The word sat in the chamber for a moment. What's the removal timeline? Samir asked. For all 47 workings. Not quick. Griphook moved around the diagnostic platform with the deliberate steps of someone calculating in real time. Several of these are layered in a way I have not seen before, they're load-bearing on each other. Remove the wrong one first and the structural collapse is immediate and catastrophic. The correct sequence must be determined before we begin. He paused again over a section of the map. Whoever did this was skilled. Yes, Samir said. They were. Griphook looked up at him. You have the signature comparison. Samir took the parchment from his inner pocket and handed it over. The goblin healer read it. His face did not change, goblin faces rarely did in ways that humans could easily read, but something shifted in his posture. Very slightly. The kind of shift that meant the information had landed with weight. I'll need to send a report to the chief, he said. I know. Tell Ragnarok I'll brief him personally. Tonight if he's available. He'll be available, Griphook said, with the certainty of someone who understood exactly how high a priority this was about to become. Samir nodded. Then he looked at Harry, lying on the diagnostic platform with the facility's instruments running their quiet assessments, his breathing easier now than it had been in that cupboard, his color marginally better, his green eyes closed. 2 years old and already the subject of the most significant curse-breaking case Samir had ever encountered. Take the pain anchors first, he said. Whatever the sequence requirements, those come first. Griphook looked at him steadily. You have opinions about my sequencing. I have one opinion about one priority. The rest I defer to your judgment entirely. A pause. Then, the pain anchors first, Griphook agreed, as if he'd already reached the same conclusion and was merely noting the alignment. Yes. Amara caught Samir's arm as he turned to leave the chamber. Briefing room, she said, low. Before Ragnarok. We need to be on the same page about how we present this. We present it accurately. We present it accurately and strategically. There's a difference. She steered him toward the corridor. Ragnarok is going to want to use this. Of course he is. And we need to decide how much of that we're comfortable with before we walk into that room. Samir stopped walking and looked at her. Amara. A child had 47 curses put on him before his 2nd birthday. By the most powerful wizard in Britain. Who then placed him with muggles who kept him in a cupboard. He resumed walking. I am completely comfortable with however much political leverage the Goblin Nation wishes to extract from that situation, because the alternative is that the man responsible faces no consequences, which is not something I am willing to entertain. I agree with you, she said, falling into step beside him. I'm just making sure you've thought past the anger. I have. Good. A brief pause. Because the anger is very loud from where I'm standing. The anger is appropriate. The anger is absolutely appropriate. I have my own. I'm just quieter about it. She pushed open the door to the briefing room, a small, stone-walled chamber with a table, 4 chairs, and a speaking tube connected to the chief's office. Sit down. Let's build the presentation. They spent 40 minutes in that room, and what came out of those 40 minutes was not a report. A report was a document. What they built was a case, layered, sequenced, airtight, with every piece of evidence in the correct order and every legal citation cross-referenced with every piece of documentation. The blood scan results. The signature comparison. The memory records from Desley. The structural survey of the property at Privet Drive. The environmental scan data. The medical intake readings from Griphook's facility. The dating analysis showing the progression of workings from the child's earliest weeks of life. 47 workings. 1 signature. A systematic, deliberate, sustained campaign of magical interference against a child who could not consent, could not resist, and had no one in a position to notice. By the time they were done, the case document ran to 19 pages in Goblin legal format, which translated to approximately 60 pages in ministry format and was, in Samir's assessment, more than sufficient to make Albus Dumbledore's professional and personal reputation a historical item. There are 3 things Dumbledore is going to argue, Amara said, reviewing the final pages. First, he'll argue necessity, that the workings were protective, not harmful. Second, he'll argue authority, that as magical guardian or acting guardian he had some right to place workings on the child. Third, he'll argue intent, that whatever the workings look like, they were meant to ensure the boy's survival. The medical data destroys the first argument, Samir said. The compression damage alone. You don't compress a child's magical core into near collapse for protective purposes. Agreed. The second argument is more dangerous because there's no formal guardianship record, which cuts both ways. He had no authority, but he'll claim informal authority as the architect of the child's safety. Which we counter with the placement record. He put an orphan child with muggles under no formal arrangement and no ministry oversight. That's not guardianship. That's concealment. And the third argument? Intent doesn't determine damage. Samir closed the case document. If I curse someone with the intent of protecting them and the curse nearly kills them, my intent is not the relevant legal question. Amara tapped the document thoughtfully. There's something else. The loyalty anchors, the 3 root-level workings targeting a single beneficiary. We can't name the beneficiary from the scan alone. Dumbledore's legal team will argue the beneficiary could be anyone. The signature analysis establishes that all 47 workings were placed by Dumbledore. The loyalty anchors were placed by Dumbledore. If he placed loyalty anchors pointing toward a single beneficiary, Occam's razor suggests the beneficiary is Dumbledore himself. He paused. But you're right that it's not conclusive. We flag it, we note the limitation, and we let it stand as an open question in the formal record. Open questions in legal records have a way of being answered eventually. A knock at the briefing room door. One of the junior clerks, young, efficient, slightly wide-eyed in the way of someone who had recently been informed that the thing happening in sublevel 7 was the thing that was happening. Mr. Voss. Chief Ragnarok will see you now. Ragnarok's office was not the ceremonial chamber that visiting dignitaries were taken to, the one with the high ceilings and the carved reliefs and the general atmosphere of an institution that had been significant since before their grandparents' were born. His working office was smaller and considerably more honest, a room full of documents, an enormous desk covered in the organized complexity of a mind that was always running multiple tracks simultaneously, and a fireplace that was currently not lit because Ragnarok ran warm. He was standing when they came in, which meant he'd read Griphook's preliminary report and hadn't been able to sit still since. Ragnarok was old in the way that the most senior goblins were old, the age less visible in any particular physical feature and more present in the quality of his attention, the sense of depth behind his eyes, the particular patience of a creature that had spent a very long time watching the wizarding world do what it always did and had made various plans accordingly. He was not tall. He was not imposing in the way that humans generally associated with authority. He was simply, completely, in command of every room he occupied, and this was his room. He looked at the case document Samir set on his desk and didn't pick it up immediately. He looked at Samir. "Tell me," he said. So Samir told him. Without the document. From memory, in sequence, the way he'd narrated field reports 100 times. He kept his voice level and let the facts carry what the facts carried, which was considerable. He did not editorialize. He did not add interpretation. He laid out what they'd found, what the scan showed, what the signature comparison confirmed, and what the medical assessment established. When he finished, Ragnarok was quiet for what felt like a long time but was probably 15 seconds. Then he picked up the case document and began to read. Samir and Amara waited. The office was very quiet. Somewhere in the deeper corridors, one of the cart systems rumbled, a routine vault run, completely indifferent to the fact that 7 floors above it the most politically significant morning in goblin-wizard relations since 1998 was underway. 47, Ragnarok said, without looking up. Yes. All Dumbledore. 98.7% signature match. Ragnarok turned a page. The medical prognosis. 3 months without intervention before the compression damage became self-sustaining. After that, loss of magical core, then death. Samir paused. Griphook has already begun the removal sequence. Pain anchors first. Full removal will take weeks, the layering is complex and the sequence has to be precise. Griphook is the best healer in this facility. I know. That's why I wanted him. Ragnarok closed the document and set it down with the same care that Samir had given the blood scan parchment earlier, the careful handling of something that was both fragile and explosive. He looked at the fireplace for a moment. Then back at Samir. The wizarding world, he said, has spent the last year and a half celebrating Albus Dumbledore. The man who guided them through the war. The man who placed the Potter child in safety and set the stage for Voldemort's defeat. He said the name without flinching, which was one of the things Samir respected about him. There is an entire narrative already built. A monument, essentially. And you are standing here with documentation suggesting the foundation of that monument is rather different from what was presented. Yes. You understand what happens when we move on this. Yes. The ministry will push back. Hard. There are people in the Wisengamot who owe their positions to Dumbledore's endorsement. There are people in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement who will experience this as an attack on the established order and react accordingly. Ragnar's voice was measured and entirely without alarm, because he was describing a situation he had clearly already analyzed. We will be accused of fabrication. Of political motivation. Of attempting to undermine the stability of the post-war magical community. I know. And you are recommending we proceed anyway. Chief Ragnar, Samir said, we found a dying child in a cupboard under some stairs with 47 curses embedded in his blood. All placed by the same man. There is no world in which I recommend anything other than proceeding. Ragnar looked at him for a long moment. Something in the quality of his attention shifted, not approval, exactly, Ragnar didn't traffic in approval, but a kind of alignment, a recognition that the positions were the same. The emergency guardianship filing, Ragnar said. Already drafted, Amara said, and produced the parchment. Ragnar took it, read it, picked up his seal without being asked, and pressed it to the bottom of the document. That is now in force. The child is under Gringotts' guardianship effective this moment. He handed the document back to Amara. I will want the full legal team assembled by morning. I will want every piece of documentation tripled in copies, one set in the main vault, one set in the secondary archive, one set in the external secure location we maintain in Edinburgh. He was already moving toward his desk. And I will want a response prepared for the ministry inquiry that will arrive. He checked the ornate clock on his wall. Within 36 hours of Dumbledore discovering the child is no longer in Surrey. What kind of response? Amara asked. The kind that is accurate, legally impregnable, and makes absolutely clear that Gringotts is not requesting the ministry's permission for anything. He sat. Get me the full legal team. Get Griphook's preliminary medical report as soon as it's ready. And get some sleep, you're going to need it. It was a dismissal, delivered with the efficiency of someone who had 17 other things requiring his attention. Samir picked up his field satchel, and he and Amara moved toward the door. Voss. He paused. You did the right thing, Ragnar said, and returned to his documents before Samir could respond. The next 3 days in the medical facility were the kind of intense, focused work that Samir lived for, the kind where every hour produced something new and every new thing demanded an immediate response. The curse removal sequence required his involvement not because Griphook needed help but because several of the workings were constructed using techniques that the healer, brilliant as he was, hadn't encountered in clinical practice. Curse breaking and healing overlapped in theory but diverged sharply in method, and the workings on Harry Potter sat precisely on that overlap. The pain anchors came out first. All 4 of them. The process took 6 hours and was delicate in the way that diffusing something load-bearing was delicate, too fast and the rebound damaged the surrounding tissue, too slow and the working had time to entrench further. Samir worked alongside Griphook in a silence broken only by necessary communication, and when the last anchor was neutralized and the readings confirmed, he sat back and let himself breathe for a moment before they moved on. Harry slept through most of it. Whatever sedation the facility used, it was deep and effective, and the boy's face in sleep had a quality of peace that Samir suspected was unusual, peace that came partly from the sedation and partly, he thought, from the removal of 4 workings that had been making every moment of comfort actively painful. On the second day, Amara came to the medical chamber with 2 things, a mug of extremely strong coffee that she handed to Samir without comment, and a piece of news. Dumbledore's been to Privet Drive, she said. Samir took the coffee. When? Yesterday evening. The property monitoring we left on the house flagged it. He arrived by apparition, spent approximately 20 minutes inside, and left. She paused. Our property environmental scan recorded the visit. He attempted to access the cupboard. Another pause. The access attempt included a locator spell. He was looking for the boy. And found him gone. She sat on the edge of the instrument bench. He'll know it was Gringotts. The Muggle Dursleys won't have been subtle about who visited. Let him know. Samir drank the coffee. It was exactly as strong as it needed to be, which was one of the things he appreciated about Amara. She understood that coffee was a tool rather than a beverage. What's his move? If I were him? Ministry first. Try to contain it at the institutional level before it becomes public. He'll go to Fudge. Cornelius Fudge is new, he's insecure, he's desperately eager for Dumbledore's approval, and he'll do whatever he's told if it's framed as stability protection. She considered. Then probably Gringotts directly, a formal inquiry, polite on the surface, with the implicit weight of his position behind it. Ragnarok will enjoy that conversation. Ragnarok has been waiting 30 years for a version of this conversation, Amara said, not without some satisfaction. On the third day, Harry Potter opened his eyes. Not the brief half-consciousness of the cupboard, not the sedated drifting of the facility's first hours, but genuine wakefulness, eyes open, tracking, present. He was still in the medical chamber, still on the diagnostic platform which had been made considerably more comfortable in the intervening days, with a proper mattress and the conjured blanket from the transit bubble that had somehow remained as a constant because it was his and removing it had seemed wrong. Samir was reviewing the diagnostic readings when it happened. He heard the slight change in the monitoring instruments, the shift in rhythm that indicated the subject had moved from sleep to wakefulness, and looked up to find two very bright green eyes watching him with the particular combination of wariness and assessment that he recognized as the expression of someone who had learned that new environments required evaluation before trust. He set down his work and moved his chair so that he was at eye level with the boy rather than standing over him. At 2 years old, Harry Potter was exactly old enough to understand that the person in the room was not one of the people from before, and exactly old enough to find that worth thinking about. "Good morning," Samir said. Same level, unhurried tone. "I'm Samir. We met for a moment the other day. You were very tired." Harry looked at him. His gaze moved around the room, checking exits, checking other occupants. There was a junior healer in the far corner, mostly invisible behind an instrument bank, before coming back to Samir. He didn't speak. "You're in a safe place," Samir said. "You don't have to do anything. Are you hungry?" A pause. Then a very small, very guarded nod. Samir reached for the tray that the facility had prepared and had been waiting for this moment, standard items, soft and easy, the kind of food you offered someone whose body had been running at a deficit. He set it on the platform beside the boy and let him take it at his own pace, which he did, eating with a methodical focus that suggested significant experience with the concept of limited availability. That detail, too, went into the record Samir was keeping. Not on parchment. The other kind. Where, the voice was small, slightly hoarse, working through the unfamiliarity of words. "Where is this?" "Underground," Samir said. "In a bank. In London." "Have you heard of London?" A small frown. The intelligence in those green eyes was doing something, cataloging, connecting. Then, big city. Very big, yes. Biggest in Britain. Harry processed this. Ate another piece of bread. "Did you take me from the small house?" "Yes." "Why?" Samir looked at the 2-year-old across the tray of food and thought about how you answered that question. The true answer was layered and complex and involved legal frameworks and political implications and a 19-page case document and the most significant betrayal in contemporary wizarding history. The true answer for right now, for this moment, for this child, was considerably simpler. "Because you needed help," he said, "and I was there." Harry considered this. He ate the last of the bread. He looked at Samir with those assessing green eyes and seemed to reach some internal conclusion, because the quality of his attention shifted, the wariness didn't disappear, it was too established for that, but something loosened slightly. A held breath, released. "Okay," Harry said. It was not gratitude, exactly. It was more fundamental than gratitude, it was acceptance, the willingness to provisionally extend existence in a new place without having all the information yet. Samir recognized it for what it was, which was a remarkable thing in a child of this age and also, in context, an entirely reasonable response to a life that had taught him to operate on partial information. Okay, Samir agreed. He was back at his instruments when Amara appeared in the doorway with the expression she wore when information had arrived that required immediate attention. Ministry Owl, she said, holding up a scroll sealed with the Department of Magical Law Enforcement stamp. Addressed to the chief. Also, she held up a second scroll, this one sealed with a different seal, blue wax, distinctive. Personal correspondence for you. He recognized the seal immediately. Everyone in the wizarding world would have. The interlocked initials in the blue wax had been on enough official communications, enough public statements, enough Hogwarts letters and Wisengamot minutes and International Confederation documents, to be practically a symbol in their own right. APWBD. He broke the seal and read. The letter was 2 paragraphs. The first was a politely worded expression of concern regarding the welfare of the child known as Harry Potter and a request for clarification as to his current whereabouts and status. The language was careful, not demanding, not threatening, pitched at exactly the frequency of reasonable concern from a responsible adult. The second paragraph was a gentle note that Samir might not fully appreciate the complexity of the situation, that there were considerations of a sensitive nature that made the child's particular circumstances unusual, and that Dumbledore would be grateful for the opportunity to discuss the matter in person at Samir's earliest convenience. It was a masterful piece of correspondence. Polite, reasonable, impossible to object to on its surface, and containing underneath its surface the clear structural message that the writer believed this was a situation he could manage through conversation, that he was accustomed to conversations going his way, and that he was currently operating on the assumption that the person on the other end of the letter was manageable. Samir read it twice, then set it down and picked up his pen. He wrote 1 paragraph. He informed Dumbledore, with the same professional courtesy the letter had employed, that Harry Potter was currently under Gringotts emergency guardianship per Section 8 of Goblin Law, that the grounds for this guardianship included findings of immediate mortal peril and active dark magical workings, that all relevant documentation was in the bank's possession and multiple secure copies, and that any inquiry regarding the child's welfare should be directed to Gringotts Legal Division rather than to individual staff members. He signed it with his professional title and the Gringotts Field Operative seal. He did not offer a meeting. Amara read it over his shoulder and made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more the auditory equivalent of a raised eyebrow. He's going to know from that letter exactly how much you have. Yes, Samir said, folding the letter and pressing his seal to it. That's why I wrote it that way. The ministry's letter to Ragnarok arrived the following morning and was, as Amara had predicted, an inquiry framed as a courtesy, the Department of Magical Law Enforcement seeking clarification regarding a matter of significant public interest, the welfare of a child of considerable historical importance to the magical community, the standard procedural language that meant we want you to hand this over without a fight. Ragnarok's response, which Samir was not present for but which was summarized to him afterward by one of the legal clerks with the barely suppressed delight of someone who had witnessed a thing, was a comprehensive explanation of Goblin legal authority, the precedent supporting the emergency guardianship provision, the bank's right to conduct full diagnostic scans under the circumstances that obtained, and the 17 reasons why the ministry had no jurisdiction over proceedings that had been initiated under an older and specifically non-supersedable legal framework. It was, reportedly, 11 pages. The ministry's letter had been 2. Meanwhile, in the medical facility, the curse removal continued. The binding weaves were the most technically demanding, the 7 layers grip hook had identified, each one dependent on the others, had to come apart in a specific order that required constant monitoring because the process of removal changed the structure of what remained. It was like disassembling a load-bearing wall in a building that was occupied. Every brick you took out shifted the weight onto the remaining structure, which then had to be reassessed before the next brick could come out safely. Samir and Griphook developed a working rhythm over 4 days of this, the healer managing the structural integrity, Samir reading the curse architecture and identifying the removal sequence, the junior healers monitoring Harry's vital signs and the state of his magical core throughout. The magical core, once the first binding layer came off, was extraordinary. Not in a subtle way. Not in the way that a skilled observer might notice in someone who simply had strong magical talent. It was extraordinary in the way that made Griphook pause his instruments and look at the readings twice, and made the junior healer in the corner actually audibly inhale, and made Samir sit back in his chair and stare at the diagnostic projection for a moment with an expression he probably needed to manage better. The core, freed from the first binding layer, had immediately expanded. Not dramatically, not in a way that any instrument in the room could have missed, but with the particular quality of something that had been compressed far below its natural size and was, the instant the compression was slightly relieved, beginning to reassert its actual dimensions. Samir had broken curses on powerful witches and wizards before. He'd worked on aurors who'd been hit with compressing jinxes, on magical individuals of above-average ability whose cores he'd had cause to assess. He'd done the theoretical studies on magical core metrics, read the academic literature, understood the scaling systems. The reading on Harry Potter's magical core, corrected for the remaining binding layers that were still suppressing it, was outside the scale his instruments were calibrated to measure. "Griphook," he said. "I see it," the healer said. "Is the instrument calibrated correctly?" "I calibrated it myself this morning." Samir looked at the reading. Then at the child sitting on the padded platform, eating what appeared to be a piece of fruit that one of the junior healers had brought him, entirely unaware of the diagnostic projection, entirely unconcerned with anything that wasn't the piece of fruit. "How many binding layers are left?" 5. "And the core is already reading at this level?" "Yes." Samir let that settle. 5 more binding layers to remove. A core that, even with 5 compressive workings still in place, was registering beyond the scale of standard measurement. He thought about what Dumbledore must have seen in this child. What assessment he must have made to conclude that 47 workings were necessary. What he had been afraid of, or what he had been planning for, or both. The compulsion weaves came next, and these were different from the others, not structurally complex, not particularly powerful in the sense of raw magical force, but precise in the way of workings that had been designed for a specific psychological purpose. He could read, in the construction of each one, the intended effect. The compliance working was designed to reduce the subject's tendency to resist authority figures. The smallness working was designed to suppress the subject's natural impulse toward self-assertion. The third was subtler, harder to name at first, and then he named it, invisibility. Not literal, but behavioral, the tendency to take up as little space as possible, to avoid being noticed, to operate below the attention threshold of the people around him. All 3 of these, he noted in the documentation with the precise dispassion of a professional, were working specifically designed to make a child manageable. To make him easy to overlook. To make him, effectively, a passenger in his own life until whoever held the relevant authority decided it was time for him to become relevant again. He documented them. He added them to the case file. He noted that their removal would require psychological support alongside the magical intervention, because workings that had been in place since infancy left traces that were not purely magical. On the 5th day, Harry spoke to him unprompted for the first time. Samir was doing the morning diagnostic review, checking the overnight readings, noting the progress from the previous day's removals, when he became aware that the boy was watching him with an expression of focused consideration. "Are you fixing me?" Harry asked. Samir set down the diagnostic scroll. "Yes. Something was making you ill. We're getting rid of it." Harry thought about this. What was it? Curses. He said it simply. Magic that someone put on you that was hurting you. We're taking it out. Who put it there? The question was so direct that it required a moment. Not because Samir didn't know the answer but because the knowledge of how to answer it for a 2-year-old was different from the knowledge of the answer itself. He looked at Harry, the green eyes, absolutely focused, waiting. Someone who made a bad decision, Samir said. We're dealing with them. Harry absorbed this. Are you angry at them? A little bit. You don't look angry. I try not to look it when I'm working. It interferes with the instruments. He picked up the diagnostic scroll again. But yes. Harry nodded, apparently satisfied with this, and returned to the book, mostly pictures, large and colorful, that Amara had produced from somewhere and left for him the previous day. Amara appeared in the doorway at noon with the expression that meant new developments. This time she came all the way in, waited until Harry was absorbed in the picture book, and sat beside Samir at the instrument bench. "Sirius Black," she said, quietly. Samir looked up. "What about him?" Griphook flagged it this morning. He was running a cross-reference on the Potter estate records as part of the guardianship documentation. She paused. Sirius Black is Harry's legal godfather. Formal magical binding, registered with Gringotts at the time of the ceremony in 1980. It's in the Potter family vault records. He's in Azkaban. He's in Azkaban without having had a trial. She held his gaze. Sirius Black was sent to Azkaban in November 1981 without a single formal hearing. There is no trial record. There is no conviction record. There is a ministry detention order signed by, she paused. Signed by Bartemius Crouch Sr. Countersigned, as witness to the security arrangements, by, don't tell me. Albus Dumbledore, she said. Samir looked at the instrument bank. He looked at the readings, the steady, improving vital signs of a child who was, day by day, being given back something that had been taken from him. He looked at the parchment in Amara's hand. The legal godfather of a minor child under Gringotts guardianship has rights of claim that supersede ministry detention in cases where the detention has not been formally adjudicated, he said. It's in the Goblin Family Rights Charter. Section 23. I know. And the absence of a trial record makes Black's detention legally indefensible under any framework that acknowledges habeas corpus, goblin or otherwise. I know. So we have two cases now. We have two cases, Amara agreed. Which is going to make our legal team's morning extremely interesting. She paused. It's also going to make Dumbledore's morning extremely interesting, once he realizes what we've found. Samir looked at Harry again. The boy had abandoned the picture book in favor of a methodical inspection of the monitoring instrument nearest his platform, touching its surface with one careful finger and watching the needle move with an expression of serious scientific interest. Hey, Samir said. Don't touch the. Harry touched it again, deliberately, watched the needle respond, and looked up at Samir with an expression that was the first genuinely childlike thing Samir had seen on his face. Curiosity, uncomplicated. The pleasure of figuring out how something worked. It moves, Harry said. It moves when it detects magic. Stop doing that or it'll skew my morning readings. Harry touched it one more time, very gently, and then folded his hands in his lap with the gravity of someone who had made a considered decision to comply. The ghost of something that was almost a smile moved across his face. Samir looked at the child who had been systematically made small and still and invisible since before he could remember, who had spent his first 2 years in a cupboard under some stairs, who was carrying the diminishing but still significant weight of 47 deliberate violations, and who was, nonetheless, here, curious and present and poking instruments to see what happened. He thought about what Ragnarok had said. We will be accused of fabrication. Of political motivation. Of attempting to undermine the stability of the post-war magical community. He thought about Dumbledore's letter. The careful language. The assumption of manageability. There are considerations of a sensitive nature. He thought about Sirius Black in Azkaban for 1.5 years, without a trial, the legal godfather of this child, put there under the counter-signature of the man who'd placed 47 curses on a boy who couldn't yet walk. He opened his field notebook to a fresh page and began to write the preliminary petition for Sirius Black's case review. He wrote quickly, because there was a great deal to do and the day was already moving, and somewhere above them the wizarding world was continuing to exist in the story it had been told about itself, and that story had a great many gaps in it, and Samir Voss had always found gaps professionally irresistible. Chapter 3, The War and Parchment. The Gringotts legal chamber on the third sublevel was not a room designed for comfort. It was designed for work: long stone table, 14 chairs, wall-mounted document racks running floor to ceiling on 3 sides, and a speaking tube system that connected to every relevant department in the bank simultaneously. The chairs were goblin proportioned, which meant that Samir spent most of the morning meeting slightly too upright, which he'd long since decided was probably intentional. Ragnarok sat at the head of the table. 7 members of the Gringotts legal division flanked him, the senior team, not the general staff. These were the goblins who had spent decades in the contested jurisdictional spaces between goblin law and ministry law, who knew every overlap and every gap and every place where the two frameworks disagreed with each other in ways that could be leveraged. They had names, but in formal proceedings they operated by function, and the function that mattered most this morning was that they were very good at what they did and were all, to varying degrees, enjoying the opportunity to do it in a situation of this magnitude. Samir had been in enough of these meetings to read the room's energy accurately. This was not dread. This was anticipation. Amara sat beside him with the full case document, the medical reports from Griphook, the memory records from Surrey, and the preliminary petition for Sirius Black's review, all organized in the precise sequence she'd spent the previous evening perfecting. She had also, somehow, located coffee, which she distributed to the two of them with the efficiency of someone who understood that the next several hours were going to require sustained function. The ministry's second communication arrived this morning, said the lead legal counsel, an ancient goblin named Sharpfong whose name was entirely accurate in both the literal and professional sense. He set the scroll on the table without ceremony. The language has changed. The first was an inquiry. This one is a demand. On what grounds? Amara asked. The child is described as a ward of the British wizarding state, his protection being a matter of national magical security. Sharpfang's tone was entirely flat, which was how he communicated contempt. They are requesting immediate transfer of custody to the Ministry's Department of Magical Child Services. The Department of Magical Child Services, Samir said, has 11 staff members and was established in 1987, meaning it did not exist when Harry Potter was placed in Surrey without any oversight whatsoever. They're inventing a jurisdiction. They are attempting to, Sharpfong agreed. The emergency guardianship provision predates the Ministry of Magic itself. Their argument has the structural integrity of wet parchment. He set the ministry scroll aside with the dismissiveness it deserved. However, the political pressure it represents is real. We have been informed, through an unofficial channel, that Cornelius Fudge has been personally briefed on the situation and is personally invested in its resolution along lines favorable to the current establishment. Dumbledore got to him, Amara said. Within approximately 18 hours of the child's removal from Surrey, Sharpfong confirmed. Which speaks to either excellent intelligence or a prepared contingency. Samir thought about the letter he'd received. The careful language. The assumption that the situation was manageable. Dumbledore had been operating on the assumption that he could contain this through the ministry, and the ministry had obliged by immediately trying to comply. The machine was working exactly as it had been built to work. What's our legal position in plain terms? He asked. Sharpfong looked at him. Our legal position is that we are standing on ground so solid it is essentially bedrock. The emergency guardianship provision is invoked, documented, and filed. The grounds, mortal peril, active dark magical workings, absent competent guardian, are established by medical evidence from our own facility, which has been gathering records on the subject's condition for 6 days. The blood scan results are admissible under every relevant framework, including the ones the ministry prefers. And the ministry has precisely no mechanism for overriding an invoked Section 8 provision. They can make noise. They cannot make law that supersedes ours, because ours is older and was specifically designed to be older for exactly this reason. And Sirius Black. The Black petition is more complicated. Sharpfong picked up the preliminary document Samir had drafted. Not because the legal argument is weak. The argument is strong. The absence of trial record alone is sufficient to demand a review, and the godfather rights under the family charter create a standing claim that the ministry cannot simply ignore. The complication is that Black has been in Azkaban for over a year. His mental and physical condition is unknown. And any action on his behalf requires us to formally allege that his detention was improper, which puts us in direct conflict with the ministry on a second front simultaneously. We're already in direct conflict with the ministry, Samir said. We are. The question is whether we wish to expand the battlefield. Ragnarok, who had been listening in silence since the meeting began, chose this moment to speak. We expand it, he said. The room didn't shift, exactly, everyone in it already knew this was his position, but the words had a settling quality, a finalization. Black's case is documented evidence of the same pattern of behavior we are already prosecuting. If we establish that Dumbledore placed 47 workings on the Potter child and also facilitated an illegal detention of the child's magical godfather, we are not making two arguments. We are making one argument twice. He looked at Sharp Fong. File the Black petition. It will be filed this afternoon, Sharp Fong said, and made a note. There's a third complication, Amara said. Everyone looked at her. She produced a separate piece of parchment, not part of the main case document, something she'd evidently prepared separately. I've been going through the broader record. The Potter estate. The documentation of Harry's placement in Surrey. The timeline. She set the parchment on the table. Lily and James Potter were killed on October 31, 1981. The following morning, November 1st, before any formal legal proceedings regarding the child's guardianship, before any ministry involvement in establishing care arrangements, Harry Potter was physically transported from Godric's Hollow to Privet Drive, Surrey, by Albus Dumbledore. We know this, Samir said. What we didn't have until this morning is this. She tapped the parchment. The Potter family had a will. Registered with Gringotts in 1980, updated in 1981. The will names specific guardianship arrangements in the event of both parents' deaths. James Potter's nominated guardian for Harry is Sirius Black, as godfather. Lily Potter's nominated guardian, as secondary, is Alice Longbottom. She paused. Neither of them was contacted. Neither appointment was honored. The will, which is a legal Gringotts document and therefore not subject to destruction or suppression by the ministry, was simply not enacted. The room was quiet for a moment. The will is in the family vault? Ragnarok asked. Yes. We have the original. As of this morning, we also have a notarized copy in each of our secure archives. A will registered with Gringotts is a binding legal instrument under both Goblin law and, technically, Wizarding inheritance law, Sharp Fong said, slowly. The slowness was not uncertainty, it was the quality of someone assembling something large very carefully. The failure to enact it constitutes, at minimum, contempt of Gringotts' legal process. At maximum, he paused. At maximum, in combination with the removal of a minor from the jurisdiction of the nominated guardian, and the subsequent placement of that minor in conditions constituting harm, and the presence of the named party's magical signature on documented illegal workings on the minor's person, it's not just dark curses, Samir said. It's everything together. The curses. The illegal detention of Black. The suppressed will. The unsupervised placement. It's a sustained, deliberate pattern of control over a child and everyone who might have protected him. He could hear his own voice staying level and was aware that keeping it level was requiring concentration. He didn't just curse Harry. He cleared the field. He removed every person who might have stood between Harry and whatever Dumbledore had planned for him. The silence in the room was the silence of people who were processing not just information but implication. We file everything, Ragnarok said. Today. The full curse documentation, the medical evidence, the will suppression, the Black petition, the property records from Surrey. Everything we have, simultaneously, to the Wisengamot public record. He looked at Sharp Fong. Is there a mechanism? There is a provision for emergency Wisengamot filing under circumstances of documented harm to a minor magical citizen. It requires the filing to be made public record immediately. It cannot be sealed, cannot be suppressed, cannot be reviewed prior to publication. Sharpfang's amber eyes had something in them that was as close to satisfaction as his face permitted. It was designed, in 1804, to prevent exactly this kind of institutional suppression. Interestingly, the provision was championed at the time by the goblin representative to the joint legislative body. Of course it was, Samir said. We file under that provision, Ragnarok said. And we ensure that every relevant journalist, every independent legal observer, and every Wisengamot member who does not owe their seat to Albus Dumbledore's patronage receives a copy of the filing simultaneously. Amara was already making notes. Samir was watching Ragnarok and thinking about the conversation he'd had with Amara in the briefing room. Ragnarok is going to want to use this. Yes. Unambiguously, Ragnarok was going to use this. The question he'd been asking himself then, how much of that are we comfortable with, had been answered by the discovery of the will, by Sirius Black in Azkaban, by the systematic, deliberate architecture of what Dumbledore had built. It had been answered by the image that he couldn't stop returning to, a bolt on the outside of a cupboard door. A child inside. An entire magical society celebrating the man responsible. He was comfortable with all of it. The filing happened at 2 in the afternoon. Samir didn't watch the legal team work. Their process was precise and professional and didn't require an audience, and he had his own work to do. He was back in the medical facility by 11:30, where Griphook was preparing for the next removal session and Harry was having what appeared to be a serious conversation with the junior healer about the relative merits of different fruits, which had somehow become his dominant interest over the past 2 days. He wants to know why some fruits come in red and some in green, the junior healer told Samir, with the expression of someone who had been asked this question several times. Because plants evolved different colorations to attract different, Samir paused. That's a very good question, actually. I'll think about how to explain it properly. Harry looked at him with an expression that indicated he expected a proper explanation would be forthcoming. Later, Samir said. After Griphook's done the morning session. The morning session was one of the compulsion weaves, the compliance working, the one designed to make Harry less likely to resist authority figures. The removal was clean, faster than the bindings, and when it was done the diagnostic projection showed the improvement in Harry's core metrics immediately. Samir sat back and recorded the results and tried not to think too analytically about what the compliance working had been doing to the boy's moment-to-moment experience of the world. Tried and mostly failed. Afterward, when Harry was resting and the instruments were running their continuous monitoring, Samir went to the window. There were no windows this far underground, but there was a projected view, a goblin design choice he'd always found thoughtful, a constantly updated image of the street level outside Gringotts' main entrance, a rectangular slice of London daylight in the stone wall. He stood at it and looked at the sky and thought. The owl arrived at 3. Not a ministry owl this time, a large, elegant eagle owl, distinctive in a way that Samir had only ever seen in pictures but that his pattern recognition identified immediately. The owl came through the facility's external communication point, was processed by the bank's security system, was verified as non-hostile, and arrived at his location with a letter that bore a seal he'd last seen on the letter he'd responded to 3 days ago. This letter was longer. The tone had changed. The careful politeness was still there. Dumbledore was too skilled a communicator to abandon his register entirely, even under pressure. But the substructure had shifted. The first letter had been written by a man who believed he was managing a situation. This one was written by a man who had read the filing. He knew. Everything we filed, Samir thought. He's read all of it. The letter ran to 4 paragraphs. The first acknowledged that Samir had demonstrated considerable dedication to the child's welfare, which was admirable, and that the medical findings were concerning, which he took seriously. The second explained, at some length, that the situation surrounding Harry Potter was one of extraordinary complexity, that the child occupied a unique position in the ongoing struggle against dark forces, and that the measures Samir had characterized as harmful had in fact been implemented as a protective framework whose full nature was not something that could be adequately conveyed in a legal document. The third paragraph stated, with the gentle firmness of someone used to ending debates rather than continuing them, that the path Samir was currently on would cause significant harm to the stability of the post-war magical community, and that this was not, surely, his intention, and that he hoped they could speak directly. The fourth paragraph was one sentence. The child must return to his proper place. Samir read it twice. Not because it was difficult to understand, it was extremely clear, but because he wanted to make sure he was reading the tone accurately. He was. The letter had moved through polite concern and arrived, in that final sentence, at something that was not quite a threat but occupied the territory adjacent to it. Must. Not should. Not I believe it would be best. Must. He set the letter down. He picked up his pen. He wrote 3 sentences. Dear Professor Dumbledore. Harry Potter is under Gringotts' emergency guardianship, the grounds for which are documented in the public filing made to the Wizengamot this afternoon. His proper place is wherever he is safe. He sealed it and sent it back with the eagle owl, which departed with the slightly offended dignity of a bird that had expected more substantial correspondence. The news broke the following morning. The Daily Prophet's front page carried the filing summary, not the full document, which ran to 63 pages in ministry format, but a summary that was more than sufficient. The headline, in the Prophet's characteristic font, was not subtle. Gringotts files against Dumbledore, dark workings found on Potter child. The subheading, slightly smaller, Godfather held without trial, family will suppressed, bank demands answers. Samir read it over breakfast in the staff room off the main legal corridor. The article itself was reasonably accurate. The Prophet journalist had worked from the public filing and hadn't embellished much, probably because the actual facts didn't require embellishment. The blood scan results. The 47 workings. The signature comparison. The will. Black's detention. All of it, laid out in the compressed language of news reporting, stripped of the legal architecture but retaining the essential shape. He was on his second cup of coffee when Amara appeared in the doorway. She had a copy of the Prophet in one hand and a piece of parchment in the other and an expression he couldn't immediately read, which usually meant the news was mixed. How bad? He asked. Depends on your perspective. She sat down. The Prophet story is generating significant public response. We've had 43 owl deliveries this morning, mostly from wizarding families who want to express concern about the findings. Several Wizengamot members who are not aligned with Dumbledore have formally requested access to the full filing. 3 international magical bodies have been in contact with Ragnarok's office wanting to discuss implications. She put the parchment on the table. On the other side, the ministry has issued a public statement. Fudge himself. Samir picked up the parchment. It was a transcript of Fudge's statement, which had been delivered at 9 in the morning to a gathered press. The statement was, in essence, an assertion that the Gringotts filing was premature, that the findings were being taken out of context, that Albus Dumbledore had served the wizarding community with distinction and dedication for decades and deserved the benefit of the doubt, and that a full ministry investigation had been initiated, the results of which would provide clarity. A ministry investigation into Dumbledore, Samir said, run by a ministry that Dumbledore effectively controls. Yes, Amara said. Which is why Ragnarok this morning preempted it by filing a formal request with the ICW. Samir looked up. The International Confederation of Wizards. Dumbledore is supreme mugwump of the ICW. His authority there is significant but not absolute, and the ICW has its own independent investigative body that operates outside any single national ministry's jurisdiction. She paused. Ragnarok's filing to the ICW requests an independent review of the British ministry's handling of the Potter guardianship matter and the Black detention, on the grounds that both cases may constitute violations of international magical law. He's boxing Dumbledore in from every side simultaneously. Ragnarok has been thinking about this for longer than we have, Amara said, with what sounded like genuine admiration. He had frameworks ready. Of course he did. Samir looked at the Prophet front page. At the headline. He thought about how many people were reading it this morning, in homes and offices and over their own breakfast tables. Thought about what it meant for the narrative to shift, the monument Ragnar had described, the structure that had been built around Dumbledore's reputation, and what it felt like when cracks appeared in something that had been presented as solid. He thought about the people who would resist the cracks. Not because they were evil. Because the monument was their landmark. Because they'd organized their sense of safety around its existence, and asking them to look at what it was built on was asking them to feel unsafe. Those were the people Dumbledore was counting on. The ones who needed him to be what they believed he was. The ones who would be told that Gringotts had a political motivation, that the evidence was being misrepresented, that context they didn't have would explain everything, and who wanted to believe it, because the alternative was harder. There's going to be backlash, he said. There's already backlash, Amara said. I've seen 3 opinion pieces this morning arguing that Gringotts is acting outside its authority and that the bank has historically held grudges against the ministry going back to the 1800s. She picked up her own coffee. Which is true, incidentally. Goblins do hold grudges. They also keep records, which is why the grudges are substantiated. McGonagall's owl arrived at noon. Samir had never interacted with Minerva McGonagall directly, but her reputation was the kind that preceded itself by such a considerable distance that it was essentially its own entity. Deputy Headmistress of Hogwarts, head of Gryffindor House, Order of Merlin First Class, widely considered to be one of the most formidable witches of her generation. Also, by most accounts, personally devoted to Dumbledore with the loyalty of someone who had fought alongside him and trusted him implicitly for 30 years. Her letter was brief and written in a tight, controlled script that communicated the writer's emotional state more clearly than the words themselves. She wanted to meet. Not at Gringotts, neutral ground, she specified. She named a location and a time. He read it again, and then went to find Amara. She's not Dumbledore's messenger, Amara said, after reading it herself. This is personal. I know. She's been on the front page of the Prophet 3 times today as a named character in the filing. She signed the letter Dumbledore sent to the Dursleys in 1981, we have the memory record from Petunia confirming it, which means her name is in the documentation. She may not have known what she was signing. She may not have. Amara handed the letter back. Are you going? Yes. He folded it. Neutral ground is fine. She's not a threat. She's someone trying to reconcile something she trusted with something she's reading in the papers. Be careful anyway. I'm always careful. Amara gave him a look that communicated, with remarkable efficiency, exactly how much she disagreed with that characterization. The location McGonagall had specified was a small tea room in Diagon Alley, off the main thoroughfare, the kind of place that had been there long enough to be part of the street's character without being notable enough to attract attention. Samir arrived 10 minutes early, assessed the exits, chose a table with sightlines to the door, and ordered tea he didn't particularly want because the situation seemed to call for it. McGonagall arrived at exactly the specified time. She was a tall woman, severe in the way of someone who had long since decided that severity was more useful than its alternatives, her hair in its characteristic tight bun, her expression doing something complicated that she was visibly managing with considerable professional skill. She sat down, did not order anything, and looked at him with the directness of someone who had decided that pleasantries were an indulgence for a different conversation. You have the blood scan results, she said. Yes. And the signature comparison. Yes. She looked at him steadily. I need to ask you something and I need you to answer me honestly. All right. Is there any possibility the signature comparison is wrong? He met her gaze. No. There are curses that can mimic signatures. There are techniques for, Professor McGonagall. I've been doing this for 12 years. I know every technique for signature mimicry that exists. The analysis protocol we use tests for all of them. The result is a 98.7% match, the remaining 1.3% is measurement uncertainty inherent to the instrument, not ambiguity about the source. He kept his voice level and let the words carry what they carried. The curses on Harry Potter were placed by Albus Dumbledore. Repeatedly. Over time. Starting when the boy was approximately 3 weeks old. The controlled severity of her expression didn't crack, but something behind it shifted. A kind of weight settling. "I placed Harry at Privet Drive," she said. "I was there. I watched Dumbledore leave him on the doorstep." Her voice was very even. "I had reservations. I told him so." She paused. "He told me it was for the best." Samir said nothing. "I checked on the house," she said. "Once. In November 1981. I was there when it was dark, watching, before Dumbledore arrived. I saw the Dursleys. I didn't go inside." Another pause, this one longer. "I told him they were the worst sort of muggles." "What did he say?" "He said the blood protection required it." She looked at her hands on the table. "He said Harry needed to be there, with his mother's family, for the protection to hold. He was very certain." She looked up again. "Albus is always very certain." "I know," Samir said. "I've known him for 40 years. He taught me. I've fought beside him. I've trusted his judgment on things that mattered enormously." She stopped. "What the filing describes. The will. Sirius Black," she stopped again. "Sirius Black is in Azkaban. Without a trial." "Yes. He was, they said he betrayed the Potters. That he was the secret keeper. That he wasn't the secret keeper. The will establishes that the Potter family's actual secret keeper was Peter Pettigrew, who switched roles at the last minute at Dumbledore's suggestion. There's a memorial reference to it in James Potter's personal correspondence in the vault." Samir paused. "We don't have enough on Pettigrew to make a formal allegation yet. But we will." McGonagall's face had gone through several things in the past 30 seconds that she was only partially managing to contain. He watched her take a breath and reassemble her composure with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom composure was a professional requirement. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Continue. We file everything, we let the legal process run, and we let the evidence speak." He paused. "What are you going to do?" The question landed. She'd known it was coming, she'd initiated this meeting, which meant she'd been asking herself the same question and wanted something from this conversation to help her answer it. He watched her face settle into something that was neither resolution nor refusal but the particular expression of someone who had found the point of no return and was standing exactly on it. "I don't know yet," she said. "Honest, at least. I've been loyal to Albus for a very long time." "Loyalty isn't permanent," Samir said. "It's a relationship with conditions. It makes sense until the conditions change." He stood, leaving coins on the table for the tea. "When the conditions change, it's not betrayal to notice." He left her sitting there and walked back out into the alley, where the afternoon was carrying the particular electric quality of a day where something significant had shifted. He could feel it in the foot traffic, the knots of witches and wizards outside the prophet's office, the raised voices, the copies of the newspaper held in hands that weren't quite sure whether to put them down or fold them or keep reading. The wizarding world was doing what it did when the story it had been told about itself turned out to be complicated. It was arguing, loudly, in public, with the slightly panicked energy of people who hadn't decided yet what to believe. Good, Samir thought. Arguing meant awake. Awake meant the evidence had a chance. The black situation accelerated faster than he'd anticipated. By the third day after the filing, two things had happened in quick succession. The first was that the ICW's independent review body, the Magical Oversight Committee, had formally acknowledged Ragnarok's request and opened a preliminary inquiry. This did not make Dumbledore immediately accountable to the ICW, but it created a formal international mechanism that couldn't be shut down by the British ministry, and it established a paper trail that made it considerably harder to make the domestic situation go away quietly. The second was that Amara, who had been pursuing the black documentation with the same methodical persistence she brought to everything, found the arrest record. Not a trial transcript, there was no trial transcript because there had been no trial. But there was an arrest record, and the arrest record, when you read it carefully, contained a detail that changed the legal landscape considerably. Sirius Black had been arrested on November 2, 1981. He had been transported to Ministry holding the same day. He had been remanded to Azkaban, not on a conviction, not on a judicial order, but on a ministerial detention notice signed by Bartemius Crouch Sr. under emergency wartime powers. The emergency wartime powers that Crouch Sr. had been using extensively in 1981 for fast-tracking detentions. The emergency wartime powers that had specifically not been subject to judicial review. The emergency wartime powers that had, this was the detail that Amara had found, buried in the procedural notes, required a co-signature from a senior member of the Wisengamot to be legally valid beyond a 30-day period. Sirius Black had been in Azkaban for 17 months. The co-signature required to sustain his detention beyond 30 days was Dumbledore's. And the co-signature had been given without a hearing, without review, without any legal examination of the evidence against Black. He signed it because Black was the godfather, Samir said, reading through Amara's documentation in the briefing room at 11 at night, the stone floor cold through his boots, the speaking tube silent for once. Get rid of Black and you get rid of the one person with a legal claim to Harry that could override whatever Dumbledore set up. That's the argument, Amara said. We can't prove motive conclusively. But we can prove that the detention is legally indefensible and that Dumbledore's co-signature sustained an illegal imprisonment. That's sufficient for the petition. File it in the morning. I already filed it an hour ago. She produced the confirmation. Emergency release petition under Section 23 of the Goblin Family Rights Charter, combined with a formal challenge to the detention's legal basis. The ICW inquiry team has been copied. She paused. Samir. If this goes through, it will go through. The legal basis is non-existent. When it goes through, she corrected, Sirius Black gets out of Azkaban. He's been there for 17 months. With Dementors. She looked at him steadily. He's not going to be in good condition. I know. And he's going to want to see Harry. Samir looked at the documents on the table. At the case that had started with a malediction gauge and a cupboard door and had, in 10 days, expanded into something that touched every corner of the story the wizarding world had been telling about the last 2 years. He thought about a 2-year-old boy in the medical facility below them, who was eating fruit and poking instruments and sleeping better now that 4 pain anchors had been removed from his body, and who had no memory of Sirius Black, and who had no context for any of this. One step at a time, he said. That's your plan. One step at a time. My plan is to do the next right thing and not get ahead of myself. He looked at her. What's your plan? My plan has 17 steps and a contingency for each of them. She picked up the document stack. Which is why we work well together. He almost smiled. Which is why we work well together. Dumbledore's formal response to the Wisengamot filing came on day 12. Not through the prophet, not through the ministry, not through the intermediary of an owl letter, Dumbledore sent a formal submission to the Wisengamot public record, which was published simultaneously with his submission, which meant that the prophet had it at the same time as anyone else. Samir read it the same way he'd read everything else, once quickly for overall shape, once carefully for content. It was, he had to admit, extremely well constructed. The man was brilliant. That had never been in question. The submission addressed the medical findings by arguing that the workings had been placed as a protective framework in the specific context of Voldemort's active threat, that a child carrying the magical signature of the prophecy required additional protections that conventional magical practice didn't cover, and that what appeared to be harmful workings were in fact defensive constructs whose function was only legible in the context of the broader threat environment. He used the term framework of love to describe the overall design, which Samir annotated with a single word in the margin, definition. The submission addressed the will by noting that circumstances of wartime and immediate post-war instability had required decisions to be made rapidly and in the best interests of the child, that the formal guardianship arrangements had been superseded by practical necessity, and that Sirius Black's arrest had made his nomination as guardian moot. The submission addressed Black's detention by not addressing it. There was a single sentence: "The circumstances of Mr. Black's arrest are a matter for the Ministry's review." Nothing more. The submission concluded by noting, with the careful concern of a man who had dedicated his life to the wizarding world's well-being, that the current legal proceedings were causing unnecessary distress and instability, and that the most important consideration must always be the welfare of the child. Samir underlined that last line. "He's claiming to care about Harry's welfare," Amara said, reading over his shoulder. "He's claiming it publicly, in the official record, in a way that's going to be very difficult to reconcile with the medical evidence." Samir set the document down. "Which is exactly what we want. The wider the gap between what he claims and what the evidence shows, the harder it is for anyone to stand in the middle." "McGonagall," Amara said. McGonagall. He'd been thinking about her since their meeting in Diagon Alley. She was the most significant variable he hadn't accounted for yet, not because she was dangerous to them, but because she was important. Her loyalty to Dumbledore was genuine and long-standing and not the kind that shifted easily, but it was also, he thought, the kind that had a breaking point. And the breaking point mattered because McGonagall's credibility in the wizarding world was real. She was not Dumbledore, but she was someone who people trusted, someone whose position carried weight, and if she moved, his thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the briefing room door. A legal clerk, young, efficient, slightly breathless. "Mr. Voss. Chief Ragnarok requests your presence immediately. There's been a development." Ragnarok's office. Sharpfawn was already there, along with two other senior legal team members. Ragnarok was standing, which had become his default in recent days. On the desk was a parchment that had clearly just arrived, the seal already broken. "The ICW Magical Oversight Committee," Ragnarok said, as Samir came in. "They've made their preliminary determination." Samir crossed to the desk. The parchment was in the formal ICW script, 3 paragraphs. He read it fast. The preliminary determination found sufficient grounds to open a formal investigation under the International Statute of Magical Rights, specifically the provisions relating to the rights of magical minors and the prohibition of non-consensual magical modification of a living subject. The investigation would operate under the ICW's independent jurisdiction. The investigation's scope would encompass the findings in the Gringotts filing and the related matters of guardianship, detention, and will suppression. And, this was the line that Samir read twice, pending the outcome of the formal investigation, the ICW was formally requesting that Albus Dumbledore stand down from his role as Supreme Mugwump for the duration, citing the standard conflict of interest provision applicable when a sitting Mugwump was personally named in an active investigation. "He'll fight it," Samir said. "Undoubtedly," Ragnarok said. "But fighting it requires him to engage with the ICW on the ICW's terms, which removes him from the comfortable domestic ground where he has the most influence." He looked at the parchment. "It also means that the British ministry, whose political cover has been Dumbledore's presence and authority, is now exposed. Fudge is going to panic. Fudge has been panicking since the filing. Now he's panicking without a safety net." Samir thought about that. Fudge panicking without a safety net was a variable that could go multiple ways, toward desperate defense of Dumbledore, which would be politically catastrophic and probably know it, or toward the other option, the one that politicians chose when the ship was clearly going down and self-preservation became the primary navigation tool. "He'll distance himself," Samir said. "Fudge will distance himself from Dumbledore once the ICW request becomes public. Because the alternative is being associated with someone under international investigation, and Fudge's primary concern is always Fudge. Which is why," Ragnarok said, and there was something in his tone that was very nearly satisfaction, I sent the ICW determination to the Prophet 10 minutes ago. Samir looked at him. It will be in the evening edition, Ragnarok said. Along with our statement welcoming the investigation and our formal reiteration of the medical evidence. He returned to his desk. By tomorrow morning, Cornelius Fudge will be facing a decision about which way to face. I intend to make the correct direction very clear. Samir left the office and walked back through the corridor toward the medical facility with the particular feeling of a case in motion, not resolution, not yet, not remotely, but momentum. The sense of a structure under genuine pressure. He pushed open the door to the medical chamber and found Griphook completing the day's session notes and Harry sitting cross-legged on his platform with a piece of parchment on his knee, making marks on it with a crayon that Amara had added to the growing collection of items that had accumulated around the boy in the past 10 days. The marks were letters. Approximate, large, clearly practiced, the particular concentration of someone who was learning the mechanism of a skill and finding it interesting. You're writing? Samir said. Harry held up the parchment. The letters were HRRY in large, uneven strokes. Amara showed me, he said. That's your name. I know. He said it with a kind of simple ownership that caught at something. Not performing pride, just matter-of-fact acknowledgement. This is mine. I know it. What does yours look like? Samir crossed to him and crouched beside the platform. He took the crayon and wrote his name next to Harry's. Harry studied it seriously. Longer, Harry observed. It is. More letters. Which one is yours? He pointed to each letter, said them. Harry repeated each one back, quietly, testing the sounds. Outside the medical chamber, in the corridors and offices and legal rooms of the bank above, the war in parchment was continuing, filings and counterfilings, statements and responses, the ICW determination spreading through the wizarding world's communication networks with the speed of something genuinely significant. The political architecture that Dumbledore had built and inhabited for decades was under a stress it hadn't been designed to withstand. Down here, a 2-year-old was learning to write his own name. Samir handed the crayon back. Harry returned to the parchment with the focused seriousness of someone who had identified a thing worth doing and was going to do it properly. The man who put the curses on you, Harry said, without looking up from his letters. Is he in trouble? Samir was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. He's in a lot of trouble. Harry made another careful letter. Not at once, small and definitive, the way he did when information had been received and processed and filed in the correct place. Then he went back to writing his name, letter by letter, in the quiet underground light of a room where things were, slowly and irrevocably, being made right. Chapter 4, The Boy Who Chose 9 Years Was a Long Time to Watch Someone Grow Up. Samir had not planned to still be involved. That had never been the intention. Find the child, document the harm, invoke the legal provisions, hand it to the correct structures and return to the Gnosis decryption, which had waited 12 weeks already and could presumably continue waiting but really shouldn't. That had been the plan. The plan had been reasonable. The plan had lasted approximately 3 weeks before it became clear that the correct structures, while functionally robust in the legal sense, did not include anyone who was going to sit with a 2-year-old in the medical facility at 11 at night when the remnants of a pain anchor flared during removal and the child needed a familiar face more than he needed another competent professional. So Samir had stayed. Not as a guardian, Ragnarok held that role formally, and the legal arrangement was specific and documented and had survived 4 ministry challenges and 2 ICW review requests over the intervening years. But as something that didn't have a precise official title, which had never particularly bothered him. Harry called him Samir. Later, Harry called him various other things, most of them in the exasperated register that teenagers deployed against adults they trusted, which Samir took as a reliable indicator of the relationship's health. Amara had stayed too, for her own reasons, which she never fully articulated and didn't need to. She had simply continued to be present in the incremental way of someone whose presence had become structural. The curse removal had taken 4 months total. Griphook the Elder, working with Samir through 63 separate sessions, had removed all 47 workings in the correct sequence without a single instance of core collapse or irreversible damage. What remained afterward, what Harry's magical core looked like once the last binding layer came away on a Tuesday morning in December 1982, was something that Griphook had written a 50-page clinical paper about, which had been published in the Goblin Medical Practitioners Quarterly under a pseudonym for reasons that should have been obvious. The paper described, in careful clinical language, a magical core of a magnitude that the instrument calibration systems available at the time were insufficient to measure at the upper bound. It described a recovery trajectory that suggested the compression damage would be largely self-correcting once the bindings were removed, the core pathways reshaping themselves over months with an efficiency that exceeded any documented precedent. It described, in the final paragraph, the healer's professional assessment that the subject, once fully recovered and properly educated, would likely represent one of the most magically powerful individuals in documented history. Griphook had shown Samir the draft before submission. Samir had read it, handed it back, and said, "Don't name him. Not in the paper, not in any footnote, not even in a way that makes him identifiable." Obviously, Griphook had said, with the expression of someone who found the suggestion that he might have done otherwise faintly insulting. Harry grew up in an arrangement that was, by most conventional measures, unusual, and by Harry's own eventual assessment, fine. The Gringotts sublevels were not, obviously, a long-term residential environment for a child, and within 6 months of the emergency guardianship invocation, Ragnarok had arranged a proper home, a house in Edinburgh, the same city as the secure archive, which was coincidentally the city where Amara had been born and where she maintained a flat and where, it turned out, she had a considerable number of opinions about how to set up a household for a child. The house was comfortable and unremarkable from the outside and had security arrangements that would have given the Hogwarts wards pause. Samir was there 4 days out of 7, on average. Sometimes more. He told himself this was because the Edinburgh office was convenient for several of his ongoing projects, which was true. He also told himself that it was because someone needed to make sure Harry was eating properly and not spending entire days reorganizing the instrument collection that had, somehow, migrated from the medical facility to the house over the course of several months. This was also true. There was a third reason that he was less methodical about articulating to himself, but Harry seemed to understand it anyway, in the way that children who paid close attention to adults understood things that the adults hadn't said. The education question was resolved through a combination of approaches. Amara handled the foundational academics with the same systematic thoroughness she applied to everything. Griphook provided magical theory instruction. Ragnarok, when Harry was old enough to sit through it without physically vibrating with boredom, provided history, real history, not the ministry-approved curriculum, but the complete and complicated and frequently uncomfortable version. Samir taught field magic, curse theory, the practical applications that the standard Hogwarts curriculum wouldn't cover until 6th year at the earliest, and which Harry absorbed with the focused pleasure of someone for whom this specific type of thinking was natural. "You're teaching a 5-year-old dark arts countermeasures," Amara said, on one occasion, watching from the doorway as Samir demonstrated the structural analysis of a simple binding hex to Harry, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor with his elbows on his knees and his chin in his hands and an expression of intense concentration. "I'm teaching him what curses look like from the inside so he'll recognize them," Samir said. "He's already had 47 of them. It seems relevant. It's also completely insane. He's fine." "Harry, what's the fundamental structural difference between a binding hex and a compulsion weave?" "Harry, without looking up, bindings restrict existing movement. Compulsions create new movement where you want it to go instead of stopping it. Like the difference between a wall and a current." "Good." Samir looked at Amara. "See?" Amara's expression communicated several things simultaneously, the primary one being that she was not going to win this argument and had made her peace with that. Harry at 7 was quiet in a way that was not shyness, it was assessment. He watched situations and people and the space between them with those green eyes and formed conclusions that were usually accurate and occasionally startling. He was funny in the dry, understated way of someone who had spent a lot of time around adults and had absorbed their register without losing his own. He was also, when something interested him sufficiently, capable of a focused intensity that could sustain itself for hours without flagging. He found that most things interested him sufficiently. The magical development followed the trajectory Griphook had predicted. By 6, Harry was producing controlled magical effects that Samir had never seen in a child of that age. By 8, he'd moved past the material that Griphook was covering and was supplementing it independently with texts from the Gringotts library, which Ragnarok had given him access to without comment, access that generally extended to sections of the library that were restricted to qualified curse breakers, because the relevant sections were the ones Harry kept finding his way to regardless of restriction, and it was more efficient to formalize the access than to keep addressing the visits. He picked the lock on the restricted section, Griphook told Samir, with an expression that was simultaneously disapproving and something that looked suspiciously like professional respect. With magic? Samir asked. With a letter opener and a technique I don't recognize and probably don't want to know the origin of. Samir didn't ask about the origin of the technique. He had a reasonable hypothesis. The political situation had moved through several phases over 9 years. The ICW investigation had concluded in 1984 with a formal finding of violations on 3 counts: non-consensual magical modification of a minor, suppression of legal documents in a Gringotts registered estate, and facilitation of unlawful detention. The finding had stripped Dumbledore of the supreme mugwump position. He'd resigned it rather than be formally removed, a distinction that everyone understood was purely cosmetic but that he'd apparently valued. He remained headmaster of Hogwarts, a position that the ICW finding didn't directly cover and that the Hogwarts Board of Governors had declined to act on, for votes to 3, in a decision that had been extensively and furiously argued about in the wizarding press for approximately 6 months. Sirius Black had been released from Azkaban in March 1983. The release had been exactly as Amara had predicted in terms of his condition. 17 months in Azkaban had done what 17 months in Azkaban did, and the process of recovery had been slow and non-linear and full of setbacks. He'd spent 2 months in St. Mungo's first, then 6 months in a private facility, and then he'd arrived in Edinburgh on a Tuesday evening and stood at the front door of the house looking at it with an expression that Samir had found difficult to read. "Is he in there?" Sirius had asked. "Yes. He's having dinner. He's 2. He won't remember you yet." Samir had paused. "We've told him about you." Sirius had not said anything to that. He had stood at the door for another moment, and then he'd come inside, and that had been the beginning of a separate and complicated and ultimately necessary process that had taken a long time and gone through a great many difficult phases and arrived somewhere that was recognizably good, though the route there had not been straightforward. By the time Harry was 11 and the Hogwarts letter arrived, Sirius was a fixed point in the household geography, present several days a week, occupying a particular armchair with the settled confidence of someone who had established territorial claim, teaching Harry things that Samir pointedly did not ask about on the grounds that the answer would probably be both impressive and professionally alarming. Harry was going to Hogwarts. This had never been in question. The question was what Hogwarts was going to make of Harry, and the related question of what Harry was going to make of Hogwarts, and the adjacent question of how Albus Dumbledore, still headmaster, still present, still operating with the particular patience of a man who believed the game was long and that he could afford to wait, was going to respond to the return of the piece he'd been waiting 9 years for. Samir had thoughts about this. So did Amara. So did Ragnarok, who had laid out in a meeting in August the precise legal conditions under which any attempt by Dumbledore to access Harry, communicate with Harry, place any further magical workings on Harry, or exercise any claimed authority over Harry would constitute actionable legal violations and would be met with the full force of everything they'd spent 9 years building. Harry had been present at that meeting, which Ragnarok had invited him to on the grounds that the subject was him and he was old enough to be present when subjects concerning him were discussed. Harry had sat at the table and listened to the entire briefing with the expression he wore when he was being very still and very attentive, and at the end of it he had asked 3 precise, well-considered questions and made one observation that had caused Sharp Fong to look at him with the expression of someone unexpectedly impressed. Then he'd said, "He's going to try to talk to me." "Yes," Ragnarok said. "And I should know that everything he says is constructed toward a purpose." Yes. Harry had nodded. Once. The small, definitive nod. Okay. There had been a long process, over several years, of talking to Harry about Dumbledore. Not in the way of persuasion. Samir didn't think you persuaded children about things that had happened to them, you gave them facts and let them form their own relationship with those facts. But Harry had needed the full picture eventually, and the full picture included the blood scan and what it had shown and what it meant, and that conversation had happened when Harry was 8, and it had been a difficult conversation. Not because Harry had broken down. He hadn't. He'd listened with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and he'd asked several questions, and then he'd been quiet for a while, and then he'd said, with the precision of someone who had located the exact center of a thing, he decided I was a piece on a board. Yes, Samir had said. Before I was even a person. Yes. Harry had thought about that. Does he know I'm not? He's starting to understand it. Good. A pause. I want to learn how to see the curses myself. The way you do. It had not been a deflection. It had been Harry choosing his response to the information, not collapse, not rage, not the paralysis of a child overwhelmed by a thing that had been done to them. It had been the decision to understand the mechanism so it couldn't happen again. Samir had spent the following week designing the theoretical curriculum and had spent the week after that teaching it, and Harry had moved through it with a speed that stopped being surprising after the first 2 sessions and became simply what Harry did when he was engaged with something. The morning of September 1st was clear and cold, the Edinburgh summer having made its usual abrupt exit at the end of August. Harry came downstairs in his school clothes looking exactly like what he was, an 11-year-old, which was something that occasionally still caught Samir slightly off guard, not because he'd forgotten how old Harry was but because the quality of Harry's intelligence and presence had a way of making you forget, in conversation, that you were talking to a child, and then you'd notice the actual child standing in front of you and briefly recalibrate. Sirius was already at the kitchen table, which was unusual for 7:30 in the morning, and suggested he'd stayed the night, which was also not unusual. He was eating toast with the focused enthusiasm of someone who had arrived at a healthy relationship with food after a period where that relationship had been severely compromised, which was one of the things Samir had watched happen over 8 years with a particular quiet attention. Ready? Sirius asked Harry. Yes. Harry set his trunk by the door, it had been packed since Monday, which was also characteristic. Is Samir coming to the station? No, Samir said, coming in from the hallway with his second coffee. I'm meeting you at the other end. Harry looked at him. You're going to be at Hogwarts. Not at Hogwarts. In Hogsmeade. I've been asked to consult on some curse-related work in the surrounding area, and the timing is, he met Harry's eyes. Coincidental. Harry did not appear to find this coincidental. He also did not appear to mind. Okay, he said, and picked up his trunk. King's Cross was managed with the efficiency that Amara brought to logistics, which meant that they arrived at exactly the right time, located the barrier between platforms 9 and 10 without difficulty, and moved through it with the minimal fuss of people who were accustomed to navigating between ordinary and extraordinary. The platform was the familiar chaos of September 1st, trunks and owls and families in various states of organized panic and the scarlet engine breathing steam at the platform's head. Harry moved through it with the ease of someone who'd been told what to expect and filed the information correctly. He looked at everything, catalogued it, didn't perform wonder but didn't suppress it either, the particular quality of someone encountering something new and finding it interesting rather than overwhelming. He was stopped twice before he reached the train. Both times by adults who recognized him, the scar was the identifier, even after 9 years, and both times with the particular wizarding response to the boy who lived that was part awe and part the complicated overlay of everything that had changed in the publicly known narrative about Harry's early years. The ICW investigation and the subsequent revelations had shifted the cultural relationship with Harry Potter's story in ways that were still working themselves out. He was no longer simply the symbol of a victory. He was also the subject of the most significant child welfare case in living memory, and the wizarding public held both of those facts simultaneously, and the combination produced a response that was uncertain in a way it hadn't been before. Harry was polite to both people who stopped him, and warm in the specific way he was warm with strangers, present but not immediately open, the wariness of early childhood having settled into something more subtle and controlled over the years. Not cold. Not unfriendly. Just himself, on his own terms. Sirius walked him to the train door. The goodbye was brief and private enough that Samir gave it space. He was watching the platform in general rather than that specific conversation, which he understood was not his to watch. What he noticed, from a distance, was that the goodbye had a quality that the earlier years wouldn't have supported, a solidity, and that both of them looked like people who knew the other one would still be there at Christmas. That was enough. The train pulled out at 11 on the dot. Samir and Sirius stood on the platform while the steam settled. Sirius had his hands in his jacket pockets and was watching the end of the platform where the train had disappeared with an expression that was doing several things. "He's going to be fine," Samir said. "I know he is." Sirius paused. "I'm not worried about Harry. I'm worried about what Dumbledore's going to say to him." Harry knows what Dumbledore is going to say. He knows the structure of it, he knows the intent behind it, and he's been thinking about what his own response is going to be for approximately the last 4 months. Sirius looked at him. "Has he told you what his response is going to be?" "Not specifically. But you have a guess." "He's going to be exactly who he is," Samir said. "And whoever isn't prepared for that is going to find it very difficult." The Hogwarts Express pulled into Hogsmeade Station at 5:30, and the first years were guided toward the boats by a figure that the current records listed as Rubeus Hagrid, keeper of keys and grounds, a half-giant who had been at Hogwarts since before Dumbledore's tenure and whose loyalty to the Headmaster was total and uncomplicated and genuine in the particular way of people who had been given shelter and belonging by someone and loved them for it without examining the architecture of the gift. Samir was watching from a distance he considered professionally appropriate, which was the distance at which he could see without being obvious about seeing. Harry crossed the lake in one of the boats with 3 other first years, a girl with a wild cloud of dark hair who was talking rapidly and gesturing and had the energy of someone who had already processed the boat crossing as a logistics problem and moved on to the next thing, a red-haired boy who was looking at everything with the open curiosity of someone for whom this was the fulfillment of something long anticipated, and a round-faced boy who was holding his toad with both hands and the expression of someone managing several anxieties simultaneously but managing them rather than being managed by them. They disappeared into the castle. Samir went to the 3 broomsticks, ordered dinner, and waited. He had been inside Hogwarts exactly once since Harry's discovery, for a mandatory professional consultation on the ward systems in 1988, during which he had been politely hosted by Professor Flitwick and had not encountered Dumbledore, by arrangement, which had been managed through Ragnarok's office with the care you applied to arrangements that needed to hold under pressure. He did not particularly want to enter the castle again. He was content to be in Hogsmeade, available, and to wait. Inside the Hogwarts Great Hall, 11-year-old Harry Potter sat with the other first years on the bench in front of the Sorting Hat, listening to the song, watching the room, and being watched by most of the room in return. He could feel it. The attention wasn't subtle, a hall full of students who'd grown up with his name as part of the story of their world, looking at the actual person attached to the name with the complex mix of expectations and revisions that 9 years of news coverage produced. He didn't find it uncomfortable. He found it interesting, the way he found most things interesting, as data rather than as weight. He noted who was looking with curiosity versus who was looking with something more complicated, and he noted where Dumbledore was sitting, and he noted that Dumbledore was looking at him with an expression of such carefully constructed benevolence that it would have read as pure warmth to anyone who hadn't been specifically taught to read the structure underneath surface presentations. Harry had been taught to read the structure underneath surface presentations. He kept his own expression easy and open, the face he used when he wanted to be read as ordinary, which was a technique Amara had taught him years ago and which he'd refined into something that was both genuine and precise. He looked around the hall with appropriate 11-year-old curiosity. He did not meet Dumbledore's eyes. Not yet. The sorting went alphabetically and Harry's name came in the H's. He sat on the stool and the hat came down over his eyes and the darkness was suddenly full of something very present and intelligent. "Well," the hat said, inside his head, in the way the hat apparently worked. "You're not what I expected." "I'm never what anyone expects," Harry thought back. "No. No, you're not." A pause that felt like the hat riffling through something. Extraordinary capability. Genuine courage, not performed, actual. A mind that works like a curse-breaking instrument, which is an unusual metaphor but accurate. And something else, another pause, "You know what I am, don't you? What a sorting hat actually does. You read the student and assign them to a house that aligns with their dominant qualities. That's the simple version. The full version is that I see all of you and make a judgment about where you'll grow best. Which means what I decide matters, not just for the next 7 years, but for what you become after." The hat seemed to be considering something. "You have the qualities for any of the 4. Genuinely, not as a consolation, any of them would take you without hesitation. The question is which one fits what you actually are, not what you've been told you should be." "I know which one fits," Harry thought. "Do you?" "I've known since I read Hogwarts, A History at 7. Ravenclaw is where people who treat knowledge as the primary tool go. That's me." The hat was quiet for a moment. "Most students want Gryffindor. Most students haven't been raised by a curse breaker and a goblin chief." Something that might have been amusement moved through the hat's presence. "Fair point. Better be, Ravenclaw." The Ravenclaw table responded. Harry set the hat aside and walked to his table with the particular ease of someone who had made a decision and was comfortable with it, and sat down between the bushy-haired girl, Hermione Granger. She'd introduced herself on the boat with the efficiency of someone who considered introductions practical rather than social, and a Ravenclaw third year who looked at him with the open assessment of someone accustomed to incoming students who were bright but not necessarily prepared for the Ravenclaw standard. "Harry Potter," the third year said. "Yes. Heard you were coming." The assessment continued. "Heard a lot of things, actually. Most of them are probably accurate," Harry said, picking up the goblet in front of him. "Which ones are you unsure about?" The third year blinked, recalibrated, and smiled. "Fair enough." Hermione leaned over from his left. "Ravenclaw is the best house," she said, as though this was a position she'd arrived at through careful analysis and was prepared to defend. "Statistically, Ravenclaw graduates have the highest rates of significant contribution to magical academia and practical application," Harry said. She paused. "Yes, and practical application." A moment. "You've read about this?" "Yes." "What else have you read?" He considered the question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. "Most of the standard curriculum, several things above it, a fair amount of specialized curse theory and magical law, the complete history of goblin-wizard relations from 1300 to present, and enough Latin to work through most spell etymology without a reference text." Hermione Granger stared at him with an expression that he recognized, from experience, as someone who had just encountered the first person they'd met in their particular category and was recalibrating the entire landscape. It was a good expression. "We should compare notes," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "We should." Dinner was excellent. Harry ate it with the appetite of someone for whom good food remains something to appreciate rather than take for granted, and he noted the layout of the great hall and the positions of the staff table and the specific quality of the ambient magic in the castle structure, which was extraordinary, layers upon layers, centuries of accumulated magical architecture that hummed against his senses the way all old magic did, rich and complex and full of story. He loved it immediately and instinctively, and filed the feeling in the category of things he didn't need to analyze, which was a small category. What he didn't do was look at the staff table. He was aware of it. He was aware, specifically, of the sustained attention coming from the center of it, not aggressive, nothing as obvious as that, but present, the quality of a gaze that was accustomed to significance and therefore given significant things to look at. He was aware of it the way you were aware of a current in water when you knew it was there and were choosing not to let it move you. After dinner, after the prefects had led the first years to the Ravenclaw Tower, up a tower staircase, through a door with a knocker rather than a password, the knocker asking a riddle that Harry answered before the prefect had finished processing the question, which produced an expression on the prefect's face that Harry catalogued for later. He was settling into his dormitory when the prefect returned to tell him the headmaster wanted a word. Harry looked at the prefect. The prefect looked somewhat uncomfortable, as if he'd hoped the delivery of this message would be straightforward. "Tell him I'll come by in the morning," Harry said. "It's been a long day." The prefect blinked. He said, "It was framed as fairly immediate." "I'm sure it was. I'll be there in the morning." Harry turned back to unpacking his trunk with the calm of someone who had decided something and wasn't reconsidering it. The prefect left. Harry heard him on the stairs outside, heard the pause that suggested he was having thoughts about how to convey this, and then heard him continue down. He felt Hermione's eyes on him from across the dormitory. She'd been given the same tower, same corridor. Girls sighed. No, she was in the corridor door, watching. "The headmaster sent for you on the first night," she said. "Yes." "And you said morning." "Yes." A pause. Most people wouldn't do that." "I know." He looked up. "Most people haven't had 9 years to think about it." She considered him for a moment. "I read about your case," she said. "When it was in the papers. I was young but I remember my parents talking about it. My mum she was upset. About the cupboard." She paused. "She cried, actually." Something warm moved through him at that, not sadness, or not only sadness, but the feeling of being real to someone who had no reason to need him to be anything. He nodded. "Tell her thank you," he said, which was an odd thing to say, and he knew it was an odd thing to say, but Hermione seemed to understand it anyway. "I will," she said, and went back to her side of the corridor. Morning came with the particular clarity of a Scottish September. Harry went down to breakfast early, noted the positions in the hall, ate, and then went to the headmaster's office, which he located without directions because he'd studied the castle layout and had a reliable sense of spatial orientation in large structures. The gargoyle knew his name, which was interesting. The staircase spiraled up with the energy of a thing that had been doing this for a very long time and found it unremarkable. He knocked. "Come in, Harry," said the voice from inside. The office was exactly what Samir and Amara and Ragnarok had described to him over the years, each in their own way, the descriptions collectively building a picture that the reality now confirmed. Large, circular, full of the accumulated evidence of a long and complicated life, instruments, portraits, books, the particular atmosphere of a space where significant things had happened and continued to happen. The man behind the desk matched every photograph Harry had seen, tall, old, white-bearded, the half-moon spectacles, the particular quality of presence that genuine power and long practice produced. Dumbledore looked at him with an expression of such warm welcome that it would have been entirely convincing to someone who didn't know it was constructed. "Harry," he said. "I'm so glad you're here." Harry sat down without being invited to, which was the first statement. He looked at Dumbledore directly, which was the second. He let the silence run for a moment rather than filling it, which was the third. "Headmaster," he said. "Polite. Even. Nothing given away." "I've been looking forward to your arrival for a long time," Dumbledore said. The warmth in his voice was genuine in the way that the warmth of a skilled performer was genuine. It arose from a real feeling, but the feeling was managed, shaped, deployed. "I hope your journey was comfortable, and that your first impressions of Hogwarts have been positive." "The castle is extraordinary," Harry said, and this was completely true. "The ward structure is fascinating. Whoever laid the original foundations was working in a framework I've only read about in the 3rd century texts." Something shifted in Dumbledore's expression, not his warmth, he kept that, but something underneath adjusted. He'd expected a child. Not quite this. "You have an interest in ward construction?" "Among other things." Harry looked at him steadily. I understand you wanted to speak with me. I did, yes. I want you to know that my door is always open to you, Harry. That whatever concerns you might have, about your studies, your adjustment to Hogwarts, your situation, he paused on the word, giving it space. I am always available. I appreciate that, Harry said. I have very few concerns. The adjustment is fine. My situation, he used the same word, the same pause, giving it back. Is well managed. I'm glad to hear it. Dumbledore picked up the small instrument on his desk, the one that Harry recognized as a monitoring device, the type used to track magical signatures in the immediate environment. It was running. He was aware of that. You've had an unusual upbringing. Not, I'm sorry to say, the upbringing I had hoped for you. I had an excellent upbringing. A brief pause. Not, Dumbledore stopped. The circumstances I arranged were Privet Drive, Harry said, without heat. Where I was kept in a cupboard under the stairs and had 47 curses placed on me, several of which were producing physical symptoms consistent with imminent mortal collapse when Samir found me. He kept his voice exactly level. Not cold. Not angry. Just precise, the way you were precise when accuracy mattered. I know you're going to tell me the circumstances were more complex than they appear. I know you're going to tell me there were protective purposes. I've read your submission to the Wisingamot and the ICW filing response. I've read all of it. He paused. I understand your reasoning. I don't agree with it. Dumbledore looked at him. The warmth was still there, but something had shifted behind it, a reassessment. The peace he'd been waiting for was not the peace he'd expected. You've had people in your life, Dumbledore said carefully, who have told you a particular version of events. I've had people in my life who gave me evidence and let me form my own conclusions. Harry leaned forward slightly. The conclusions are mine, Professor. Not Samir's. Not Ragnar's. Mine. He paused. I'm not angry with you. This was true, and he knew it was true, which was something he'd spent 2 years being sure about. Anger isn't particularly useful. I just want you to understand that I'm here because I want to learn, and I'm going to learn everything this school can teach me, and I'm going to do it my way. Of course, Dumbledore said. That is all I would, and I want you to understand, Harry continued, in the same level voice, that whatever plans exist for me, whatever role I was intended to fill in whatever structure you've been building, those plans require my participation, and my participation is not something you have access to. He paused. I'm not a piece on a board. The silence in the office was a specific quality of silence, the silence of a room where something significant had been said and was settling. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. The warmth had not gone. Harry believed it was genuinely there, believed that Dumbledore did, in some real sense, care about him, the way a chess player cared about a significant piece. The understanding that the piece had its own will and was aware of the board was doing something to that warmth, not extinguishing it but complicating it, bending it into something more like genuine looking. No, Dumbledore said, and for the first time in the conversation, the constructed quality of his voice was absent. Just the words. You are not. Harry stood. I'll see you at breakfast, Professor. He moved toward the door. Thank you for making the time. He was halfway down the spiral staircase when he heard it, the very slight, very quiet sound of Fawkes the Phoenix, somewhere above him, a single note. Not a performance. The Phoenix equivalent of acknowledgement. He kept walking. Classes began the following morning and Harry moved into them with the particular pleasure of someone encountering a structured environment that was designed for exactly the kind of thinking he found most natural. He had an advantage in most subjects that he was aware of and didn't particularly hide, because hiding it would have required performing confusion he didn't feel and he had no patience for that kind of performance. He was careful to be present with the material rather than simply ahead of it. He enjoyed the actual practice of spell work, the physical sensation of directing his magic through the forms of a new technique, and he enjoyed the theory, and he enjoyed the moment when the theory and the practice connected and the connection produced something real. Hermione was in all his classes and was fast and rigorous and intellectually combative in the specific way of someone who had spent years being the smartest person in a room and had strong feelings about the experience. She was also, once she recalibrated her expectations to include the existence of Harry, genuinely excellent to think alongside, not because she agreed with him but because she didn't, and her disagreements were always substantiated, and the process of working through them produced better answers than either of them started with. "You did wandless magic," she said, at the end of Transfiguration, where McGonagall had set them the task of transforming a match into a needle and Harry had done it at approximately the point where most students were still working out their grip. "Yes," Harry said. "How?" "I've been practicing for years. The wand is a focusing tool, it helps direct the magic, but the magic itself doesn't originate in the wand. If you understand the mechanism well enough, you can direct it without the tool." He paused. "It's harder. The wand genuinely does help. But for simple work it's manageable." Hermione stared at him. Then she picked up her wand and looked at it with an expression of someone revising a conceptual framework. "I want to learn that. It takes a while." "I have a while." He smiled. "Yes," he said. "You do." McGonagall's reaction to Harry's transfiguration work had been subtler than most of the staff's. She'd made a note, her expression doing the controlled thing it did when she was feeling something she wasn't prepared to show, and moved on without comment. But at the end of class, as the students filed out, she had looked at Harry for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. He stopped. "Professor? Mr. Potter?" She paused. "How are you finding the castle?" "Remarkable," he said honestly. "Good." She paused again. He waited. "I'm glad you're here," she said, and the words had weight beyond a teacher welcoming a student, and he understood the weight, and he nodded. "Thank you," he said. He met Samir in Hogsmeade on the Saturday of the second week. The Three Broomsticks was warm and slightly too loud and exactly the right environment for the kind of conversation that needed something to absorb the edges. Samir was already there, had already ordered, and looked at Harry with the assessing expression he used when he was reading a field situation. "How is it?" Samir asked. Harry thought about the question. About the classes and the castle and the ward structure and Hermione and the sorting hat and the dormitory and McGonagall's controlled expression and the great hall humming with old magic and the moment on the spiral staircase with Fawkes. "Good," he said. "Really good." "Dumbledore?" "We talked. He picked up his butterbeer. I told him what I thought." Samir looked at him steadily. "How did he respond?" Harry considered. Like someone seeing something for the first time that they thought they already understood. He paused. "I think that might actually be true. He expected, I don't know what he expected." "Not me." "No," Samir said. "He expected the version of you he'd been planning for. He got the version that existed instead." Harry drank the butterbeer and let the warmth of the place settle around him. "It'll be fine. He's not going to stop trying to manage the board. But I'm not on his board." "No," Samir said. "You're not." Outside the window of the Three Broomsticks, Hogsmeade went about its Saturday business, students down from the castle, locals running errands, the ordinary texture of a magical community that existed in the same world as everything that had happened and was continuing to happen and would keep happening. Harry watched it for a moment, the easy movement of people in a place they belonged, and felt, without having to think about it or name it, that he was one of them. Not because of the scar. Not because of the prophecy. Not because of any plan that anyone had made for him before he was old enough to make his own. Just himself, in a place he'd chosen, having decided to be there. "Ragnarok sends his regards," Samir said. "Tell him I've found 3 instances of goblin foundational ward work in the castle's lower structure that weren't in any of the published histories." Samir's expression shifted into the one that meant he was genuinely interested. "Are they intact?" "Mostly. One's been partially overlaid with later ministry-style work, which is, Harry made an expression that conveyed his aesthetic opinion of the overlay clearly. Unfortunate. But the original architecture is still there underneath it. Document it. Already have. He pulled a folded piece of parchment from his robe and slid it across the table. Started a survey on Tuesday. It's incomplete but the methodology is sound. Samir took the parchment and unfolded it. Read it. His expression moved through several things and settled on something that Harry had seen enough times to know was pride, though Samir had never directly said so and probably wouldn't, because that was the specific way Samir operated and Harry had long since stopped needing him to be different. The methodology is more than sound, Samir said. Harry drank his butterbeer. I know. Outside, the afternoon was doing what Scottish September afternoons did, shifting through light and cloud with the variable energy of a landscape that hadn't decided yet whether it was done with summer. Harry watched it and thought about the year ahead. The classes and the castle and the people and the work, all of it. Thought about Dumbledore in his circular office, managing his reassessment. Thought about McGonagall and the weight in her words. Thought about Hermione proposing to compare notes with the confidence of someone who'd already decided they were going to be friends. Thought about a cupboard under some stairs, which he did sometimes, not with the weight of damage but with the particular awareness of someone who knew where they'd started. The distance from there to here wasn't the story, exactly. The story was the work that had been done in between, and the people who'd done it, and the boy who'd emerged from the doing of it and was, in all the ways that counted, entirely himself. Samir, he said. Thank you. He said it simply, without the scaffolding of explanation, because the explanation wasn't necessary between them and hadn't been for years. Samir set the parchment survey down. Outside, a group of third-year students went past the window, arguing cheerfully about something Quidditch-related. The afternoon moved on. You're welcome, Samir said. Chapter 5, 47 Answers. The trial was scheduled for the 14th of November. Not a ministry trial, the ministry had spent 3 years attempting to conduct its own proceedings and had produced, in that time, for inconclusive reports, 2 committee reassignments, and 1 spectacular public argument between the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and the Wisengamot that had ended with 3 senior officials resigning and the prophet running the headline who is investigating whom. In letters large enough to read from across the street. The ministry, it had become clear, was constitutionally incapable of investigating Albus Dumbledore, because too many of the people who would conduct the investigation had built their careers in the warmth of his endorsement and couldn't see past it without losing something they weren't prepared to lose. So the trial was the ICW's. The International Confederation of Wizards Magical Oversight Committee, operating under independent jurisdiction, conducting the formal proceedings that the 3-year investigation had been building toward. The venue was the Confederation's hearing chambers in Geneva, neutral ground, selected specifically because neutral ground meant neither the ministry's home advantage nor any other single nation's institutional bias. The proceedings would be conducted in multiple languages simultaneously. The evidence would be presented under the standards of the ICW's evidentiary framework, which were rigorous and old and specifically designed to resist the kind of institutional pressure that domestic proceedings were susceptible to. Samir had been preparing for this for 9 years. Longer, arguably, the documentation habits he'd developed in 12 years of curse breaking had meant that the case file was more complete than anything a less methodical investigator would have built. Every piece of evidence in triplicate. Every signature comparison cross-referenced. Every date range verified against multiple independent sources. The medical records from Griphook, now running to several hundred pages across 9 years of follow-up documentation. The will. The arrest record. The memory records from Surrey. The environmental scan from Privet Drive. Amara's documentation of the legal timeline. The ICW investigation team's 3 years of independent findings, which had confirmed and expanded and in several cases strengthened what Gringotts had originally filed. He was in Edinburgh the week before the trial, finishing the preparation. Harry was at Hogwarts, first year, October, deep in the term, which was where he needed to be. They'd talked by owl every few days, and once through the fireplace in Ragnar's Edinburgh office, and Harry had been characteristically straightforward about the trial. He knew it was happening, he'd read the case summary Samir had sent him, he had thoughts about 2 of the evidentiary points that he'd included in his owl, and those thoughts had been good enough that Samir had incorporated one of them into the presentation structure. Then Harry had gone back to his survey of the Goblin Ward architecture in Hogwarts' lower levels, which was apparently progressing. Sirius was in Edinburgh too, which was where he usually was when something large was happening. He and Samir had an arrangement that had evolved over 8 years into something that functioned like a partnership without ever having been formally named, built primarily on the shared fact of Harry and secondarily on the discovery, gradual and occasionally grudging on both sides, that they thought about things in compatible ways. Sirius brought things to a situation that Samir didn't, a particular kind of heat, an instinct for the personal dimension of things, the willingness to be publicly and loudly angry in ways that Samir managed internally. They balanced each other in ways that were mostly useful and occasionally catastrophic. "You've read the defense submission?" Sirius said. He was in the armchair, his armchair, the Edinburgh household's gravitational center, the one that had been his since approximately 1984. He had a copy of the defense document and was reading it with the focused displeasure of someone who found the material personally offensive. 3 times, Samir said, not looking up from his own work at the table. "He's going to argue the prophecy." "Yes. He's going to stand in that chamber and tell them that everything he did was in service of defeating Voldemort, and that the curses were a regrettable necessity, and that without his management of the situation, I know what he's going to argue." Samir set down his pen. His defense rests on 3 pillars. First, necessity. Everything was required by the prophecy and the strategic situation. Second, outcome. The Dark Lord was defeated, which validates the methods. Third, intent. He genuinely believed he was protecting both Harry and the wizarding world. He picked up his pen again. "We undermine the first with the medical evidence, which establishes that several of the workings were not protective in any functional sense. We undermine the second with the legal principle that outcome doesn't retroactively justify illegal means. And the third is the hardest one," Sirius said. "The third is where Harry's testimony matters." Sirius was quiet for a moment. "He's going to testify?" "He's offered to." Samir paused. "I told him it wasn't required. The evidence is sufficient without a victim statement. But the committee requested it. And Harry decided he wanted to." He paused again. He said, and I'm quoting, "I'm not doing it for the case, I'm doing it because I have things to say and this is the correct venue for saying them." Sirius made a sound that was half laugh and half something more complicated. "That's very Harry, yes. Yeah." A pause. "He'll be fine. I know he'll be fine." Samir looked up. "I'm more concerned about you. I'm not testifying. You're attending. The man who signed the co-signature that kept you in Azkaban for 17 months is going to be in the same room." He looked at Sirius steadily. "I need to know you're not going to do something that gives the defense grounds for a disruption filing." Sirius met his eyes. The thing that had been in Sirius's face in the early years, the raw, jagged quality of someone whose edges hadn't healed properly, was less visible now, smoothed by 8 years of living rather than surviving. It was still there, somewhere underneath, because things like that didn't disappear entirely. They just found their place in the larger structure of a person. "I'm not going to do anything," Sirius said. "I'm going to sit there and watch it, and when it's over I'm going to go back to wherever we're staying in Geneva and drink something expensive and feel whatever I'm going to feel about it." He paused. "And then I'm going to go back to Edinburgh and be there when Harry gets back for Christmas." Samir looked at him for a moment longer, then nodded and returned to his work. "Samir. What do you think is going to happen to him afterward?" Sirius wasn't asking about the legal outcome. He was asking the question underneath that one, the question about what happened to a man like Dumbledore when the structure around him came down. Samir thought about it. I think the verdict is guilty on at least 2 of the 3 counts. I think there will be sanctions, removal from Hogwarts is likely, the ICW has that authority if the finding warrants it. I think his reputation will survive in a diminished form, because he's Albus Dumbledore and the wizarding world has a long memory for what it was told first. He paused. I think he'll accept it. Not because he believes he was wrong. Because he's too intelligent to pretend the evidence doesn't exist, and too proud to be seen fighting something he can't win. That's not justice, Sirius said. It's what we can get. That's not the same thing. No, Samir agreed. It isn't. They sat with that for a moment, the way you sat with things that were true but not sufficient. The fire in the grate did its work. Outside, Edinburgh went about its evening, indifferent and real. It's enough, Sirius said finally. Not convinced, not happy, but arrived at something. It has to be. Yes, Samir said. It does. The hearing chambers in Geneva were exactly what the occasion required and nothing more, a large, circular room with banked seating arranged around a central floor, the walls lined with the flags of the ICW member nations, the acoustic properties calibrated for multilanguage simultaneous translation. The committee sat at a raised bench, 7 members from 7 different national magical bodies, selected specifically for independence from the British magical establishment and the individuals named in the proceedings. Samir had been in enough formal proceedings to read a room's disposition accurately, and what he read in Geneva on the morning of November 14 was a room that had already done the work. 3 years of independent investigation by the committee's team had produced a 700-page report. The committee members had read it. The disposition of the room was not one of uncertainty about the facts had been established with a thoroughness that didn't leave significant room for doubt. The disposition was about something else, about what you did with established facts when the person they concerned was who Dumbledore was. That was the question the room was wrestling with. Samir could see it in the way the committee members held themselves, in the quality of their attention. Not did this happen but what does it mean that it happened, and what do we do? Dumbledore arrived with his legal team and took his position with the dignity of a man who had decided, before entering the room, how he was going to inhabit this experience. He was impeccably dressed, his white beard precisely ordered, his bearing neither defeated nor defiant but something in the center, the bearing of a man who had confronted the worst possibilities about himself and come to a position on them that he could maintain publicly. Samir had spent a lot of time thinking about what that position was. He thought it was something like, I was wrong in method, not in purpose, and the purpose was real, and that has to count for something. It was the most honest version of Dumbledore's self-understanding. It was also, in Samir's assessment, the version that was most dangerous, because it was partially true, and partial truth was harder to address than complete fabrication. Dumbledore did not look at Samir when he entered. He looked at the committee, at the chamber, at the flags, at the architecture of the proceeding. He looked at the room as a space he was going to have to navigate rather than one he was going to control. That was the first real indication Samir had that Dumbledore understood, at last, the full dimensions of what he was facing. Then Dumbledore looked at Sirius. Brief, controlled, the expression doing something complex and quickly managed. Sirius looked back at him from his seat in the gallery with the flat, complete steadiness of a man who had decided exactly what he was going to do and was doing it. Nothing aggressive. Nothing performed. Just there, present, witness. Dumbledore looked away first. The proceedings opened with the committee summary, the chair, a Belgian which named Vanderlinden, reading through the findings of the 3-year investigation in the careful, precise language of formal legal summary. The findings confirmed and expanded everything Gringotts had originally filed. The 47 workings, fully mapped and documented. The signature analysis, now corroborated by 3 independent magical forensics experts from 3 different countries. The medical records establishing the harm. The will. Black's detention. The pattern, laid out in the formal language of an institution that had done its work properly and arrived at conclusions it was prepared to stand behind. The room listened. The gallery was full, magical observers from across the international community, journalists from 6 countries, legal representatives from the British ministry who were there in an official capacity and who Samir had clocked the moment they came in, 3 of them, middle-tier functionaries chosen specifically because they were senior enough to be credible and junior enough to be dispensable if the political winds continued to shift. Fudge was not there. His absence was, in its own way, a statement. Samir presented Gringotts' case in the morning session. He'd done this before, not on this scale, not in front of this audience, not with this weight of consequence, but the structure of it was the same as every field presentation he'd ever given. Begin with what you found. Establish how you found it. Present the evidence in the correct sequence. Let the evidence carry what it carries. He stood at the center of the circular floor and spoke clearly and without embellishment for 2 hours. He did not perform emotion. He did not perform outrage. He walked through the morning of August 1982 from the beginning, the assignment sheet that said routine survey, the feeling as he approached the house, the malediction gauge and what it showed, the cupboard under the stairs and what was inside it, and he walked through it the way he walked through every field report, with the specific, accurate detail of someone who had been there and was telling you what it looked like. He showed them the blood scan results on the projected display. He showed them the signature comparison. He showed them the medical documentation from Griphook, the photographs of Harry's magical core mapping before and during and after the curse removal, the data series showing the improvement across 4 months of treatment. He showed them the timeline, the dates of each working, laid out against the chronology of Harry's life, showing that the first had been placed at 3 weeks old and the most recent 4 months before discovery. He showed them the will and what it said and what had not been done about it. He showed them Sirius Black's arrest record and the co-signature that had extended the detention and the section of the Family Rights Charter that made that extension legally indefensible. When he sat down, the chamber was quiet in the specific way of a room that has processed something it cannot unprocess. The defense presentation came after the midday recess. Dumbledore's lead counsel, a skilled Scottish wizard named Inverdale who had been in international magical law for 30 years, presented the defense with the competence and evident discomfort of someone arguing a case where the facts were largely against him and the strategy was therefore about framing rather than refutation. He did not contest the blood scan results. He did not contest the signature analysis. He argued necessity, strategic context, the specific demands of a magical conflict without precedent, the reality of the prophecy and what it required. He argued that the outcomes had to be weighed alongside the methods. He argued, carefully and at length, that intent mattered. He was good. He didn't change anything, but he was good. Then Dumbledore took the floor himself. The committee allowed it, the proceedings permitted the primary respondent to address the chamber directly. Dumbledore stood at the center of the circular floor in the place where Samir had stood that morning, and he looked at the committee, and then, briefly, at the gallery, and then at the floor, and then he began to speak. What he said was not what his counsel had said. It was not the defense argument. It was something more personal, more direct, and in its directness, Samir thought, more honest than anything he'd said in 9 years of legal and public proceedings. He said that he had believed what he was doing was necessary. He said that he had believed the prophecy created obligations that could not be met by conventional means, and that a child who did not know himself to be a weapon could not accidentally be one, and that the workings had been placed with the intention of protecting not just Harry but everyone. He said that he had weighed the harm against the alternative being Voldemort's return, the alternative being a war that the wizarding world might not survive, and had made a choice he believed was the correct one. He said, "I was wrong." The 2 words were said without qualification. Without the scaffolding of justification that had surrounded every previous statement he'd made about this. He said them in the silence of the chamber and let them stand. I was wrong in what I did, and I was wrong in how I thought about it, and I was wrong in my certainty that I was right. His voice was controlled but not managed in the way it usually was, the performance of warmth was gone, and what was left was older and quieter. I treated a child as an instrument. I removed his agency before he had it. I told myself it was love, in a sense, and perhaps it was, but love that operates without regard for its object's own existence is not love at all. It is another word. He stopped. I have no argument against the evidence. I have only this, that I was trying to save the world as I understood it, that my understanding was incomplete, and that the cost of that incompleteness was borne by someone who had no choice in the matter. The chamber was very still. I am sorry, he said, and sat down. Samir listened to the silence afterward and thought about what had just happened. He thought about whether it was enough. He didn't think it was enough. What Dumbledore had described doing was not a thing that could be made sufficient by acknowledgement, however genuine, and he was aware that his own judgment on this was not entirely neutral. But he also thought it was real. Whatever Dumbledore had said, it had come from somewhere that wasn't performance. The evidence that had taken 9 years to build into this room, that had started with a malediction gauge and a child in a cupboard, had done something. Not to the record, which spoke for itself. To the person at the center of it. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He filed it in a category of things that didn't need an immediate decision and returned his attention to the room. Harry arrived at the chamber for the afternoon session. He hadn't been there in the morning. He traveled from Hogwarts overnight, he and Sirius having met at King's Cross at midnight in the manner of a logistical arrangement that Samir had not been consulted on but had been informed about. He came in quietly, in the way he moved through spaces, present and unhurried, not performing either the weight of the occasion or the lightness of someone trying to appear unburdened by it. He sat in the gallery beside Sirius, and Sirius put a hand briefly on his shoulder, and Harry nodded once, and they were still. Dumbledore looked at Harry. The expression on his face was the first thing in the proceedings that had been entirely unmanaged. Something happened in it, something that was too complicated to name precisely and that Samir chose not to try to name, because it wasn't his to interpret. It was between those two people and whatever existed in the space between them. Harry looked back. His face was calm. Not cold, there was nothing of coldness in Harry, there never had been. Just present. Just himself. The afternoon session proceeded through the formal questioning phase, and then it was time for the victim statement, and Harry came down from the gallery and stood at the center of the circular floor and looked at the committee. He didn't use notes. He stood with his hands at his sides and spoke clearly and without performance, in the way of someone who had thought carefully about what they wanted to say and was saying it. I'm 11 years old, he said. I've had 47 curses removed from my body over the course of 4 months of treatment, and the medical follow-up that confirmed their effects has been running for 9 years. I was found in a cupboard under a staircase in good condition to describe the structural damage those curses had done to my magical core, except that I wasn't in good condition, and the only reason I'm alive is that Samir Voss opened a door that had a bolt on the outside of it. He paused. The chamber listened. I don't want to talk about the pain anchors or the binding weaves or the compulsion workings in technical language, because the technical language makes them sound like academic subjects and they weren't academic subjects, they were things that were happening to me while I was too young to understand that anything was wrong. I want to talk about what it means to be told, when you're old enough to understand it, that someone made a decision about your whole life before you were old enough to make any decisions of your own. He looked at the committee. I'm not angry, he said. I was, for a while, when I was 8 and 9 and working through it. But anger at someone for what they did when you were a baby is a particular kind of anger that you can't really do anything productive with, and I've spent a lot of time learning to do productive things. So I set the anger aside. A pause. What I am is clear. He looked at Dumbledore. Directly. Not with challenge, not with heat. With the same precise, steady clarity he brought to everything. You made choices about my life that weren't yours to make. You decided that the best version of me was one that had been shaped before it could resist shaping. You decided that what the world needed from me was something I would never have freely chosen to be. He paused. The interesting thing is that I don't know whether you were right about the prophecy or about the war or about any of it. I don't know what would have happened if you'd done things differently. Maybe everything would have been worse. Maybe you're correct that it was necessary, in some complicated way I can't evaluate from inside the life I've actually had. The chamber was absolutely still. But here's what I know, Harry said. The person standing in this room today is not the person you were building. The person standing in this room today learned to read curse signatures at age 5 and surveyed the goblin ward architecture in the lower levels of Hogwarts in his first month of school and has a godfather who came back from Azkaban because a curse breaker with good documentation habits found a will that you didn't enact. The person standing here was made by the people who chose to show up and do the work, not by the plans of someone who thought they knew the whole board. He paused. I can't tell you whether I'd have been better or worse at whatever you were building me for. I can tell you that I'm considerably better at being me. He looked at the committee again. I'm asking for accountability on the basis of what happened, not on the basis of what was intended. What happened is documented and the documentation is accurate. The intent doesn't change the medical record. I'm 11 years old and I had curses in my blood and I was found dying in a cupboard, and the person who put me there thought it was for the best. He paused once more. That's what I have to say. He went back to his seat. The chamber exhaled. Samir was watching the committee, and what he saw on their faces was not what you saw on faces that had been told something new. It was what you saw on faces that had been told something they already knew but hadn't quite admitted to themselves. The clarity of a thing being said exactly right. Sirius, in the gallery, was doing the thing where his face was very still and his hands were completely loose in his lap and he was breathing carefully. Samir caught his eye briefly. Sirius looked back at him and nodded, once, which was the nod of someone who was fine in the way of someone who had needed that and was only now discovering how much. The committee went into deliberation at 4:30 and returned at 7. The chair, Vanderlinden, read the findings in the measured language of formal determination and Samir listened to each one and noted each one and let them land in the correct places. Guilty on the first count, non-consensual magical modification of a minor magical citizen, in violation of Article 7 of the International Statute of Magical Rights. Unanimous. Guilty on the second count, facilitation of unlawful detention of a named guardian of a magical minor, in violation of Article 12 of the Family Rights Provisions. 6-1. Guilty on the third count, suppression of a legally registered testament with intent to prevent lawful guardianship arrangements from being enacted. Unanimous. The sanctions, permanent removal from the position of Supreme Mugwump, which had already been enacted provisionally and was now made permanent. Removal from the position of Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, effective immediately. The question of Hogwarts Headmaster referred to the Board of Governors with a formal recommendation for review, the committee declining to make that determination unilaterally out of respect for the school's independent governance. Formal censure in the International Magical Record. A period of supervised magical activity, this last was more formal than practical, but it was in the record, and the record mattered. No prison. No Azkaban. The determination of the committee was that the mitigating factors, the genuine belief, the post-war context, the sustained period of cooperation with the investigation, were sufficient to remove incarceration from the sanctions. This was, Samir knew, going to be the most contested element. Already he could feel it in the gallery, the people for whom this was not enough, who wanted something sharper, more definitive. He looked at Sirius, who had been the person most entitled to that sharper thing. Sirius was looking at the floor with an expression that was not satisfaction and not devastation but something in between, the expression of someone who had gotten most of what they were owed and was deciding whether to be at peace with most. He looked at Harry, who was looking at the committee bench with an expression of clear, calm attention, processing the findings the way he processed everything, storing them in the correct places. He caught Samir's eye across the chamber and his expression shifted slightly, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. The expression of someone who had said what they needed to say and found it had been the right thing. Dumbledore received the findings standing. He stood through all of them with the stillness of a man who had already arrived at his position on this and was holding it. When the last sanction was read and Vanderlinden formally closed the proceedings, he turned and exchanged brief words with his counsel, and then, and this was not required, not formal, not part of any procedural element, he looked across the chamber at Harry. Harry looked back. Dumbledore inclined his head. A small, precise movement. Not apologetic, exactly, he'd already said what he had to say on that count, but something else. Acknowledgement. Recognition. The particular honoring of someone as a genuine other person rather than a role in a plan. Harry received it without expression. Then he turned away, and the moment was over. Outside the hearing chambers, Geneva was doing what November evenings did, cold, precise, the particular quality of a European winter city settling into its early dark. The street outside the ICW building had a collection of reporters and observers and the general density of people for whom the end of a significant proceeding was a moment worth witnessing. Samir came out into the cold air and stopped on the steps and let the noise of it settle around him. Amara was beside him. She had been in the chamber all day, seated in the gallery, managing the documentation, being the steady presence she always was. She stood on the step and looked at the street and said nothing for a moment. 3 counts, she said finally. 3 counts, he said. It's not everything. No. She looked at him. Are you all right with that? He thought about the question seriously. I'm all right with what's possible, he said. I've been doing this long enough to know the difference between possible and complete. That's a very mature answer. Don't sound surprised. She almost smiled. I'm not surprised. I'm just noting it for the record. Harry came out of the building with Sirius beside him, the two of them moving through the gathered crowd with the ease of people who knew how to navigate attention without being redirected by it. Sirius had his arm around Harry's shoulders, the specific easy weight of someone who'd claimed the right to that gesture through years of showing up. Harry was looking at the city, the lights coming on in the buildings across the square, the unfamiliar European architecture, the cold that was different from Edinburgh's cold in ways a person noticed when they arrived somewhere new. He came to the steps where Samir and Amara stood and stopped. Guilty on 3 counts, he said. Stating the record. Yes, Samir said. And the sanctions? Yes. Harry nodded. Looked at the city again. Looked back. It's not enough, he said, and there was no bitterness in it, it was just accurate, the same quality of precision he brought to every statement of fact. But it's what's documented, and documented is what lasts. Yes, Samir said. So. He looked between Samir and Amara and Sirius. What happens next? You go back to Hogwarts, Amara said. You finish your first year. You do your survey of the goblin ward structure. You argue with Hermione about methodologies and you teach yourself things that aren't on the curriculum and you do whatever else it is you do. She paused. And the rest of this, she gestured back at the building, at the proceedings behind them, the rest of this gets managed by the people whose job it is to manage it. And Hogwarts? Without Dumbledore as chief warlock, the Board of Governors meets in December, Samir said. We have a filing with them. Ragnarok is handling it. He paused. McGonagall submitted a statement to the board last week. Harry looked at him. Supporting the review? Supporting the review. Samir watched Harry process that. It's been coming for a while. I think she needed the trial. She needed to see it laid out properly, Harry said, understanding it immediately. So she could stop asking herself whether it was real. Yes. He nodded. Looked at the city for a moment longer. Then, I'm hungry. Serious, immediately, there was a restaurant near the hotel that looked excellent. The French one? The French one. Yes, Harry said. Let's go. They walked through Geneva in the cold evening, the 4 of them, Samir and Amara slightly behind, Sirius and Harry slightly ahead, the city moving around them with the indifference of a city that had its own business to attend to and found the presence of 4 people at the center of a significant historical moment entirely unremarkable. Samir watched Harry and Sirius ahead of him, Harry saying something that made Sirius laugh, the easy back and forth of 2 people who had found their way to each other through the specific and difficult route they'd taken and were now, simply, themselves. He thought about an August morning in Surrey. About the hum of a street that was too ordinary. About a gate, a path, a door with a bolt on the outside. He thought about the list of 47 workings on a piece of parchment, and what it had felt like to read it, and the decision he'd made in that moment that had been, he understood now, looking back at it, not really a decision at all. It had been a recognition. The recognition of something that was simply the next true thing to do. He'd spent 12 years working through things that other people had left broken and trying to make them whole again. That was the job. That was what the job meant. You went in, you found the damage, you mapped it, you worked through the correct sequence, and you brought it out into the light where it could be seen for what it actually was. He had done that. The job was done. Not complete in the sense of finished. Harry's life was not finished, was barely started, was a long continuing thing with decades of its own choices and consequences ahead of it that had nothing to do with Samir and weren't supposed to. But done in the sense of the immediate work, the acute necessity, the thing that had required doing and had been done. "You're doing the quiet thing," Amara said, beside him. "I'm thinking." "You're always thinking. This is the different quiet." She looked at him sideways. "The one where you've arrived somewhere." He considered. "Maybe. Good arrival or bad arrival?" He watched Harry and Sirius turn a corner ahead of them, animated about something, the cold catching their breath in small clouds. Watched the city accept them into its evening without ceremony. "Good," he said. They had dinner in the French restaurant near the hotel, which was small and warm and had the kind of lighting that made an evening feel like it was occupying its own separate time. The food was, as Sirius had implied, excellent. Harry ate with the focused appreciation he always brought to food, and asked the waiter about the regional provenance of something on the menu, and had a conversation about it in the partially functional French he'd been teaching himself from a phrase book since September, which the waiter received with the particular indulgence that native speakers extended to sincere foreign attempts. Sirius told a story about a prank he and James Potter had run in their 4th year at Hogwarts that Harry had heard before but listened to again with the specific quality of attention he gave to stories about his parents, not nostalgic, since he had no memory of them, but interested, collecting them, building the picture of people he hadn't been given the chance to know. Amara talked about the Gnosis decryption, which Samir had finally finished in August, 2 months before Harry's Hogwarts start, and which had turned out to contain a 7th-century ward construction methodology of extraordinary elegance that had implications for 3 ongoing curse-breaking projects and had been, it turned out, worth the 14-week wait. "I told you it was worth waiting for," she said. "You told me to stop working on it and come back to it fresh. And was I right?" The solution presented itself approximately 40 minutes after I picked it back up. "So yes," she said. "I was right." "You're always right," Harry said, eating something that appeared to be very good, based on his expression. "Someone else who acknowledges this," Amara said. "Write it down, Samir." "I document everything," Samir said. "It's in the record." Harry looked across the table at him. The restaurant light caught his eyes, those specific green eyes, clear and sharp and entirely his own. He looked like himself, which was, Samir thought, the simplest and most complete thing you could say about someone, and the thing that had taken the most work to arrive at. "What are you going to do next?" Harry asked. "After all this?" Samir thought about it. There were 6 pending curse-breaking assignments in the queue. There was a symposium in Cairo in February that he'd agreed to speak at. There were 3 ongoing projects and the Gnosis methodology to apply and an entirely new area of ancient ward research that the Edinburgh Gringotts archive had opened up in the past year that he hadn't properly started yet. "Work," he said. Harry smiled. It was a full smile, the unreserved one that appeared when he found something genuinely, uncomplicatedly good. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." Outside, Geneva continued its evening. The river was somewhere in the dark beyond the restaurant windows, doing what rivers did, moving, constant, indifferent to the events on its banks, carrying what it carried toward wherever it was going. The city's lights were reflected in it in long, broken lines. The cold pressed against the glass. Inside, 4 people ate dinner and talked about things that mattered and things that didn't, and the space between them was easy in the way of space between people who had been through something together and arrived on the other side still themselves, still together, still moving forward. In a cupboard under the stairs at Number 4 Privet Drive, nothing occupied the space except dust and the absence of someone who had long since moved on. The bolt was still on the outside of the door. The house itself was no longer owned by the Dursleys. It had been acquired by the Muggle government through some process that no one had explained to the street's remaining residents and that no one had particularly questioned. It stood empty. Unremarkable. Just a house, same as the ones on either side of it, same as the one across the road. In Hogwarts' lower levels, 3 sections of 7th century goblin woodwork waited in the stone, partially obscured by later additions, patient as stone was patient, waiting to be properly mapped by someone who had the knowledge and the instinct and the time. They had been there for 700 years. They could wait a little longer. In Azkaban, no one sat in a cell on account of Harry Potter anymore. The last of those cases had been resolved in 1986. The prison continued to exist, continued to house the people it housed, continued to be what it was, a problem that required solving, but not today, not this particular battle, not this particular version of the fight. That battle was for another time and probably a different generation, but this generation had laid some groundwork for it, had established some principles about evidence and documentation and what legal frameworks were capable of when used by people who understood them and weren't afraid of the people they were aimed at. In Geneva, in a restaurant with good lighting and excellent food, Harry Potter ate dinner and talked and existed, loudly and completely and without apology, in the space that had always belonged to him and that he had finally, fully, moved into. Somewhere in the city, in the hotel where the legal teams were filing final documents and the ICW press office was preparing its morning statement, the record was being written, the formal, official, permanent record of what had happened and what had been found and what had been decided. It would be in the archive tomorrow. It would be referenced in legal scholarship for decades. It would be the document people pointed to when they talked about what accountability looked like in the magical world and what it required and what it cost. But the record Samir trusted most was not the one being filed in the ICW archive. It was the one he'd been keeping in the other way, the way that didn't use parchment, the way that was just what you carried. The record of an August morning and a bolt on a door and a 2-year-old with green eyes who had said okay to being in a new place, with a new person, who promised to help. The record of 4 months of curse removal and fruit preferences and an instrument getting poked to watch the needle move. Of Edinburgh and the armchair and Sirius coming back from somewhere terrible and being allowed to be a person again. Of a child reading every book he could find and learning to see the architecture of the world and deciding, with the absolute clarity of someone who had thought about it properly, who he was and what he was going to do with it. He'd opened a door. What came out of it had been entirely, remarkably, unstoppably Harry's own. That was enough. More than enough. That was, if he was being precise about it, and he was always precise about it, everything.